She was the daughter of one of the greatest writers in history. He never loved her for more than 15 years. She crossed oceans, followed armies, lied about marriage, and slowly lost her mind, all for a man who repeatedly told her no. This is not a love story. This is not a romance gone wrong. This is the true story of Adèle Hugo, a woman born into genius, privilege, and culture, who became one of history's most disturbing real-life stalkers. What happened inside her mind? Why did no one stop her? And how did obsession turn into madness? Stay with me, because once you understand her story, you'll never hear the name Hugo the same way again. Paris, August 24th, 1830. The city was restless that summer. Cobblestone streets echoed with the sound of carriage wheels and distant arguments about politics, monarchy, and revolution. France was changing again, as it always did, and Paris felt like a living creature that never truly slept. In the midst of that uneasy calm, in a well-appointed home surrounded by books, ink, and ambition, Adèle Hugo was born. She entered the world quietly. No great omens, no dramatic storms, no sense that history had just shifted. And yet, from the moment she took her first breath, Adèle's life would be shaped by something far larger than herself, the mind of her father. Her name was taken from her mother, Adèle Fouché, a reserved and loyal woman who had married young and devoted her life to a man who rarely belonged fully to his family. That man was Victor Hugo, not yet the giant of French literature, but already consumed by words, ideas, and an unrelenting hunger for greatness. At the time of Adèle's birth, Victor Hugo was in his late 20s. He was known in certain circles, respected but not revered. He wrote obsessively, often through the night, convinced that his destiny lay somewhere beyond ordinary domestic life. Within a year, The Hunchback of Notre Dame would begin its journey into the world, and nothing, not politics, not exile, not even his own children, would ever come before his work again. Adèle was the fifth child. That fact mattered more than anyone realized. The Hugo's first son, Leopold, had died in infancy, a quiet tragedy that left behind a permanent sense of fragility in the household. Their second child, Leopoldine, was everything Adèle would never be allowed to become: radiant, gentle, openly adored by her father. After her came Charles and François Victor, both boys, both encouraged toward intellect and independence. By the time Adèle arrived, the family was already full of memories, expectations, and unspoken grief. She grew up surrounded by brilliance, writers, poets, artists, and political thinkers passed through the Hugo household regularly. Conversations were intense, often passionate, sometimes cruel. Ideas mattered, reputation mattered, genius mattered. Children, less so. From an early age, Adèle learned to be quiet, to listen, to observe. She was educated far better than most girls of her era. She learned to read fluently, to write with precision, and to play the piano with remarkable sensitivity. Music became her refuge, a private language where emotions could exist without explanation. While others spoke of politics and literature, Adèle sat at the piano, translating feelings she did not yet understand into sound. Visitors often remarked on her appearance. She was beautiful in a restrained way. Long dark hair, pale skin, delicate features. But even as a child, there was something that unsettled people who looked at her too closely. Her eyes, they were not vacant, nor dull, but distant, as if she were always watching something no one else could see. Victor Hugo noticed her, of course, but noticing was not the same as knowing. To him, Adele was gentle, obedient, unproblematic. She did not demand attention. She did not challenge him. In a household dominated by towering intellect and grief still left unspoken, her quietness was mistaken for contentment, in truth. Adele was learning something dangerous. She was learning that love was conditional, that affection flowed unevenly, that being close to greatness did not mean being seen. As France moved through the early decades of the 19th century, through industrial growth, political unrest, and cultural transformation, the Hugo family rose steadily in prominence. Money was no longer a concern. Status was secured. The children lived comfortably, even luxuriously by contemporary standards. But emotional security is harder to inherit. Adele watched her father disappear into his work for days at a time. She watched her mother adapt, endure, and remain silent. She watched Leopoldine shine and felt herself fade in comparison, though no one ever said it aloud. Loss hovered over the household like a shadow waiting to return, even before tragedy struck again, even before death would shatter the family in ways they could never recover from. Something fragile was already forming inside Adele Hugo, a sensitivity sharpened by neglect, a longing for devotion shaped by its absence, a belief, still unconscious, that love must be chased, earned, pursued at all costs. At this stage, nothing was broken, but the foundation was uneven, and when the weight of loss finally came crashing down, it would not be Victor Hugo's towering mind that fractured beyond repair. It would be the quiet daughter who had learned too early how to disappear. As Adele Hugo grew older, the world around her grew louder. The Hugo household was never quiet, not truly. Doors opened constantly to guests whose names would one day be etched into French cultural history. Poets argued over verses. Politicians debated the future of the Republic. Painters and musicians drifted in and out, carrying with them the confidence of people who believed their ideas mattered. And in that constant motion, Adele learned where she belonged, on the edges. She sat at the margins of conversations, absorbing fragments of adult language long before she could fully understand them. Words like honor, exile, revolution, immortality. They floated above her like incantations, powerful and unreachable. Her father's voice often dominated the room, deep, persuasive, certain. When Victor Hugo spoke, others listened. Adele listened too, always. She watched how admiration worked, how people leaned forward when her father entered, how silence fell when he raised his hand, how praise followed him like a shadow. From a young age, she understood that attention was a kind of currency and that she possessed very little of it. Her mother, Adèle Fouché, tried to compensate in quiet ways. She oversaw her daughter's education carefully, insisting that Adele be taught literature, music, and languages for a girl in 19th century France. This was unusual, even progressive, but education did not equal intimacy. Lessons were structured, formal. Affection remained restrained. Emotion, in the Hugo household, was something to be managed, not indulged. Music became Adele's private refuge. At the piano, she could exist without comparison. Her fingers moved instinctively, delicately, drawing out melodies that felt too heavy to speak aloud. Visitors often paused when they heard her play. Some complimented her talent, Others smiled politely and returned their attention to Victor Hugo. Adele noticed every reaction. As she entered adolescence, her beauty became increasingly apparent. Artists who visited the house sketched her profile. Family friends commented on her long dark hair, her pale complexion, her refined posture. Yet even praise felt distant, directed at her appearance, not her inner life. In 1850, a photograph was taken of Adele, one of the early daguerreotypes that had only recently become possible. She was 20 years old. The image reveals a young woman of striking elegance, but also unmistakable melancholy. Her mouth is neutral, neither smiling nor frowning. Her eyes carry a weight far older than her years. She looks as though she is waiting for something. What that something was, even she may not have fully known by this point. Loss had already become familiar. The death of Leopold, the first child, was spoken of rarely, but it lingered in the family's emotional architecture. Absence was normalized. Grief was absorbed quietly, without ceremony. And yet, nothing could prepare the Hugos, or Adele, for the catastrophe that would soon tear their family apart. Her older sister, Leopoldine, was everything Adele was not. Confident, openly affectionate, deeply cherished by their father. When Leopoldine married young, Victor Hugo's pride was unmistakable. He saw in her happiness a reflection of his own success, not just as a writer, but as a patriarch. Adele watched this closely. She did not resent her sister. She admired her, but admiration carried a painful undercurrent, the realization that love, when it came easily to others, could feel impossibly distant to oneself. As Europe moved closer to political upheaval, the Hugo family remained outwardly stable. They traveled. They entertained. Victor Hugo's reputation continued to grow. From the outside, theirs was a life of privilege and promise. Inside, however, emotional fault lines were deepening. Adele was becoming introspective, increasingly withdrawn. She wrote privately. She daydreamed. She attached herself deeply to ideas of devotion and belonging, concepts she had observed but never fully experienced. No one considered this dangerous. She was quiet, well-mannered, talented, a dutiful daughter. But quiet does not mean untroubled. In the years before disaster struck, Adele Hugo was already forming the emotional architecture that would later collapse under pressure. She learned to endure rather than express, to long rather than ask, to watch rather than participate. And when tragedy finally arrived, swift, violent, and irreversible, it would not simply break her heart. It would shatter the fragile balance holding her mind together. In the early 1840s, life appeared to settle into a fragile rhythm. Paris remained the center of the Hugo family's world, a city of ambition, argument, and art. Victor Hugo's reputation had matured into something formidable. His words no longer merely circulated. They shaped conversations, provoked governments, stirred crowds. The household moved with the confidence of people who believed their place in history was secure. For Adele, this stability was deceptive. She was 16 when she first began to believe she understood love. His name was Auguste Vacquerie. He was older, 26, and already carried the confidence of a man who knew the world beyond salons and books. He was a writer and journalist, intelligent, articulate, and familiar. Too familiar, perhaps. Through marriage, he was connected to the family. His brother had married Adele's beloved sister, Leopoldine. The closeness made the attraction both inevitable and forbidden. To Adele, Auguste represented something intoxicating, attention directed solely at her. Their conversations felt different from those she shared with others. He listened. He responded, for the first time. She felt visible, not as Victor Hugo's daughter, not as Leopoldine's quieter sister, but as a young woman worthy of affection. Marriage was discussed, cautiously, Nothing formal, nothing explicit, just enough hope to anchor her imagination. And then, nothing. Auguste did not propose. He hesitated. He withdrew. Whether discouraged by the family, uncertain of his own feelings, or simply unwilling to commit, the result was the same. The possibility dissolved without explanation. Adele told herself she had lost interest, that it did not matter. But something subtle had shifted. The idea that love could be promised, then silently withheld, lodged itself deep within her psyche. It would not leave soon after. Her attention drifted toward another man, Jean-Baptiste Clesinger, a sculptor of growing reputation, once again. There were conversations, glances, the quiet electricity of possibility, and once again, nothing came of it. The connection faded before it could take shape. To the outside observer, these were ordinary disappointments, the kind young people experienced every day. To Adele, they were lessons. She learned that desire did not guarantee reciprocation, that longing could exist without fulfillment, that silence could follow intimacy without warning. Each experience reinforced a growing belief that love was unstable, something that appeared briefly, then vanished, leaving confusion in its wake. Then came September 4th, 1843, the day that changed everything. Léopoldine and her husband were holidaying near Villequier, along the Seine in Normandy. The weather was calm. The river appeared harmless when their small boat overturned. There was no spectacle, no dramatic storm, no heroic rescue, just cold water, heavy clothing, panic. Léopoldine's skirts, soaked and weighted, dragged her under. Her husband tried to save her and drowned alongside her. She was pregnant. By the time the news reached Paris, both were dead. Victor Hugo was traveling when it happened. He learned of his daughter's death not through a letter or a knock at the door, but by reading it in a newspaper. The shock was absolute. He collapsed inward, spiraling into a depression so severe that he stopped writing for years. The house fell silent. For Adele, the loss was catastrophic. Léopoldine had been her emotional anchor, the sister who embodied warmth, approval, and certainty. With her gone, the family's emotional center vanished. Grief consumed everyone, but it manifested differently in each of them. Victor Hugo retreated into darkness. Their mother endured quietly. The brothers sought distraction elsewhere. Adele absorbed it all. She watched grief hollow out her father. She watched her mother grow thinner, quieter. She watched the house transform from a place of voices into a mausoleum of memory. And within that silence, something in Adele began to fracture. Not visibly, not yet. She did not scream. She did not rebel. She did not demand comfort. She internalized. The tragedy confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that love was temporary, that happiness could be erased without warning, that attachment invited degradation, but rather than recoiling from this truth, Adele leaned toward it. As if, deep down, she believed that enduring pain was the price one paid for closeness. The photograph taken of her years later would capture this unknowingly. The sadness in her eyes, the tension in her stillness. A young woman marked not by one tragedy, but by a lifetime of quiet, emotional erosion. By the mid-1840s, Adèle Hugo was no longer simply a sensitive child of privilege. She was a young woman shaped by loss, disappointment, and an unfulfilled hunger for devotion, standing unknowingly at the edge of a psychological descent that would one day carry her across oceans, through delusion, and into madness, for now. However, the world continued to turn, and the next force to reshape her life would not come from within her family. It would come from history itself. By the late 1840s, France was no longer merely unsettled. It was combustible. The ideas that had simmered for decades, liberty, republicanism, the rejection of absolute power, began to erupt across Europe. Paris, as always, stood at the center of the storm. Streets once filled with carriages and café conversations became arenas of protest. Barricades rose. Flags changed. Governments fell with alarming speed. The Hugo household could not remain untouched. Victor Hugo, once sympathetic to monarchy in his youth, had undergone a profound political transformation. By this stage of his life, he was no longer simply a writer observing power. He was a public moral force challenging it. His speeches, essays, and poems grew sharper, more confrontational. He spoke openly against authoritarianism, and in doing so, made powerful enemies. For Adele, politics arrived not as ideology, but as atmosphere. She felt it in the tension of whispered conversations, in the sudden urgency of packing bags, in the way her father's name was spoken with equal parts admiration and fear. She watched visitors glance nervously toward windows. She heard her mother speak in lower tones. Stability, already fragile after Leopoldina's death, began to crumble once again. In 1848, revolution swept across France. The monarchy fell. A republic was declared, and for a brief moment, hope surged. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Within a few years, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the legendary emperor, dismantled the republic from within. In 1851, he seized power. By 1852, he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. Victor Hugo denounced him immediately and without restraint. This decision would cost the family everything they had left of normal life. Napoleon III did not tolerate outspoken opposition, especially not from figures as influential as Victor Hugo. Arrest was a real possibility. Silence was no longer an option. The choice was simple: submit or flee. The Hugos chose exile. They left France abruptly, crossing the Channel to the island of Jersey, a British territory just off the coast of Normandy. Later, under pressure from authorities uncomfortable with Victor Hugo's continued political agitation, they would move again to Guernsey for Adele. Exile was not an adventure. It was a severing. Paris had been her emotional landscape. Its streets, salons, and rhythms were familiar. Even grief had context there. Jersey, by contrast, felt small, foreign, exposed. The sea surrounded them on all sides, beautiful, endless, and isolating. The house in exile was quieter than Paris, but not calmer. Victor Hugo threw himself back into work with renewed intensity, using exile as fuel for his writing and political thought. He was productive again, perhaps more than ever. His voice reached France even from across the water. Adele watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Her father had emerged from grief through purpose. She had not. While exile sharpened Victor Hugo's resolve, it magnified Adele's loneliness, removed from familiar social structures. She struggled to adapt. The island offered fewer distractions, fewer visitors, fewer ways to escape inward reflection. She walked along the cliffs. She listened to the sea. She played the piano for hours at a time, the sound filling rooms that felt too large and too empty all at once. Her brothers found ways to occupy themselves. Her mother managed the household as best she could. But Adele drifted. There was no scandal, no dramatic breakdown, just a slow narrowing of her world. In Paris, she had been overlooked. In exile, she felt invisible. Letters from France arrived sporadically, carrying news of events she could no longer witness firsthand. Friends faded into memory. Opportunities dissolved. Life seemed to be happening elsewhere, without her. And yet, this isolation created something else as well. Space. Space for imagination. Space for longing. Space for fixation. At 24 years old, Adèle Hugo stood at a crossroads she did not recognize. Her past was defined by loss, her present by displacement, her future unknown. She did not yet know that exile would not merely remove her from France, it would place her directly in the path of the obsession that would come to define her life. Because it was here, on these quiet islands surrounded by endless water, that Albert Pinson was about to enter her story. And when he did, nothing would ever return to its former shape. Guernsey was smaller than Jersey, and harsher. The wind never seemed to stop there. It came off the Atlantic in long, relentless gusts, rattling windows, bending trees, carrying with it the salt, heavy smell of the sea. To Victor Hugo, the island felt like a fortress, a place from which he could defy an empire with nothing but words. To Adele, it felt like a boundary she could not cross. Exile settled into routine. Mornings followed predictable patterns. Victor Hugo wrote for hours, sometimes pacing, sometimes dictating with intensity that left no room for interruption. His study became sacred territory. His work was urgent, necessary. France needed his voice, even from afar. Adele understood this intellectually. Emotionally, she felt abandoned. Her mother managed the household with quiet endurance, careful not to disturb Victor's focus. The brothers came and went, finding purpose in study, travel, and political discussion. Life continued around Adele, but rarely with her at its center. She was no longer a child, yet not quite a woman with a defined place. There were fewer social gatherings on Guernsey, fewer opportunities for connection. The island's community was polite but distant. The Hugos were respected, even admired, but also watched. Adele spent long hours alone. She walked the narrow roads along the cliffs, where the sea crashed violently below. She sat on rocks, listening to waves break and reform endlessly, a rhythm that mirrored her own thoughts. At night, she returned to the piano, her playing growing more emotional, more unrestrained. Music became the only space where she felt truly present. In these years, her inner world expanded while her outer world shrank. She began writing more privately, journals, fragments of thought, reflections that oscillated between hope and despair. Her writing was not ambitious or political like her father's. It was intimate, repetitive, circling the same questions again and again. Who sees me? Who chooses me? Who stays? The absence of answers made those questions louder. Victor Hugo loved his daughter, but love was filtered through distance. He admired discipline, intellect, conviction. Adele's sensitivity, her emotional permeability, was something he did not fully understand, and therefore did not know how to address. He did not see danger in her silence. He saw compliance in the isolation of exile. Adele's need for connection intensified. Not friendship, not admiration, devotion. She longed for a bond that felt absolute, unquestionable, exclusive, unwavering. The kind of attachment that could not be taken away by death, politics, or indifference. She did not yet know how dangerous that longing was. But it was already shaping the way she interpreted the world. Small interactions began to carry disproportionate weight. A glance lingered too long. A conversation replayed endlessly in her mind. Polite interest felt like hidden meaning. Courtesy felt like promise. She did not fabricate these feelings deliberately. They emerged naturally, fed by loneliness and emotional deprivation. The quieter her environment became, the louder her inner narratives grew. Guernsey offered no release from this inward turn. And then, after nearly a year and a half on the islands, something changed. It happened without ceremony. A new presence entered her routine. Not dramatic, not immediately overwhelming, just different enough to stand out. A young British officer began visiting social gatherings connected to the island's military community. He was stationed nearby, part of the British Army contingent that maintained order across the Channel Islands. His name was Albert Pinson. To others, he was unremarkable, handsome, perhaps, but not striking, confident, but not imposing. He was known among friends as Bertie, easygoing, sociable, fond of drink and games. To Adele, he was something else entirely. He represented movement, the outside world, youth untouched by exile or grief. He carried with him the promise of escape, geographical, emotional, existential. When he spoke to her, he did so without the reverence others reserved for Victor Hugo's family. He treated her not as a symbol or an extension of greatness, but as a woman. He laughed easily. He flirted lightly, for someone starved of direct attention. The effect was immediate and profound. Adele did not fall in love all at once. She attached. The distinction mattered, but she did not yet know it. What began as interest soon became focus. What felt like affection slowly transformed into significance. Pinson became a reference point around which her thoughts began to organize themselves. In a life defined by displacement, he felt like an anchor. She did not yet realize that anchors can drag as easily as they stabilize, and she did not know, could not know, that this seemingly ordinary man would soon become the axis around which her entire reality would rotate. At first, it seemed almost ordinary. Albert Pinson began calling more frequently. He attended gatherings where Adele was present, sought her out in conversation, walked beside her during social outings along the island's narrow roads. To outsiders, it looked like a polite courtship. Nothing remarkable. Nothing alarming. To Adele, it felt monumental. Every word he spoke took on added weight. Every smile felt deliberate. She replayed their conversations in her mind at night, examining tone and phrasing for hidden meaning. In exile, where days blended together and emotional landmarks were scarce, Pinson quickly became the most vivid point in her landscape. He was 22. She was 24. Young, impressionable, and surrounded by circumstances that magnified intimacy far beyond its true scale. Pinson enjoyed her attention. That much was clear. He admired her intelligence, her musical talent, her family's prestige. Being welcomed into the orbit of Victor Hugo carried a certain allure, but admiration, for him, remained light, unburdened, casual, easily withdrawn, for Adele. It was already something else. When Pinson proposed marriage, the moment arrived not with thunder, but with quiet certainty. To him, it was a practical step, an offer made in a socially appropriate context, influenced by proximity and convenience. To her, It was validation, proof that she had finally been chosen. And yet, when the words were spoken, Adele did something no one expected. She said no. The refusal surprised everyone, including herself. Later, she would struggle to explain it. Perhaps she sensed her parents' disapproval. Pinson was known for drinking and gambling, habits Victor Hugo found distasteful. Perhaps Adele hesitated out of fear, uncertain whether happiness could be trusted after so much loss. Or perhaps the act of being wanted was, for the moment, enough. Pinson accepted the refusal with little visible disappointment. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply moved on, assuming, as many would, that the matter was closed. For Adele, it was not. In the months that followed, something shifted inside her. The proposal, once declined, did not disappear. It grew. It transformed into a reference point around which her thoughts increasingly revolved. She replayed the moment again and again, wondering what might have happened had she answered differently, and slowly, quietly, she changed her mind. In 1856, Adele began pursuing Pinson. At first, her behavior was subtle. She sought him out more often. She wrote letters, carefully composed, emotionally restrained. She positioned herself in his path, convinced that fate was merely waiting for her to correct a single mistake. But Pinson's response was not what she expected. He had already moved on emotionally. What had once been a possibility had, in his mind, closed. Her renewed interest felt awkward, excessive. Where he had once flirted easily, he now grew distant. Adele did not interpret this distance as rejection. She interpreted it as complication, in her mind. Obstacles existed only to be overcome. If Pinson seemed reluctant, it must be because something stood in the way. Duty, confusion, pressure. Certainly not lack of feeling. The idea that he simply did not love her was unthinkable. This was the moment when reality began to fracture. Historians would later identify the early signs of erotomania, a delusional belief that another person is secretly in love with the sufferer, despite clear evidence to the contrary. But at the time, no one recognized it for what it was. Adele's letters grew longer, more intense, her interpretations more elaborate. She believed she could see signs of Pinson's affection everywhere, in his silences, his avoidance, even his irritation. Each rejection was reimagined as proof of restraint rather than refusal. Pinson, increasingly uncomfortable, attempted to distance himself further, but distance only sharpened Adele's focus. For the first time, her longing took on a compulsive quality. This was no longer about affection. It was about meaning. Pinson had become the answer to questions she had been asking since childhood. Who chooses me? Who stays? Who makes me necessary? Losing him, or believing she had, felt like losing the possibility of being fully real. The Hugo family noticed changes. Adele became restless, preoccupied, emotionally volatile in ways she had never been before. She spoke of Pinson constantly, reading significance into trivial encounters. When challenged, she grew defensive, even evasive. Her parents dismissed it as heartbreak. They did not yet understand that heartbreak usually heals. Delusion does not. When Pinson left Guernsey for new postings, Adele did not experience this as separation. She experienced it as pursuit delayed, in her mind. The story was not ending. It was only beginning. And soon, she would follow him, first across the channel, then across borders, and eventually across oceans, convinced with absolute certainty that destiny was merely unfolding according to a logic only she could see. When Albert Pinson left the Channel Islands, he believed he was leaving a closed chapter behind. Transfers were routine for a young officer in the British Army. New assignments, new regiments, new cities. Movement was expected, even welcomed. Pinson was sent first to England. dividing his time between London and a regiment stationed in Bedfordshire, a quiet county far removed from the wind-swept isolation of Guernsey. To him, it was a change of scenery. To Adèle Hugo, it was a signal. She did not see his departure as rejection. She did not see it as distance. In her mind, separation was circumstantial, temporary, accidental, correctable. If he had gone to England, then England was where she needed to be. The decision formed quickly, but not impulsively. Adele framed it as practical, even reasonable. She told herself she needed a change, that travel might ease her mind, that England was close, familiar enough, and politically safe given her family's status in exile. But beneath those justifications lay a single, unshakable conviction. Albert Pinson was still connected to her. She crossed the Channel alone. England was louder than Guernsey, more crowded, more chaotic. London overwhelmed her senses, its smoke-filled streets. Endless movement and constant noise stood in stark contrast to the contemplative quiet she had grown accustomed to. And yet, the city thrilled her. Pinson was here, somewhere within this vastness. That knowledge infused every street with meaning. Adele began seeking him out methodically. She learned his routines, his regimental movements, the social circles he frequented. She appeared where he might be, at gatherings, near barracks, along routes he was known to walk, when they crossed paths. Pinson was polite, reserved, uncomfortable. He did not encourage her presence, but neither did he immediately confront it. Social norms restrained him. Her family name carried weight. He told himself she would lose interest eventually. Adele mistook his restraint for subtlety. Each brief encounter reinforced her belief that something remained unresolved between them. She scrutinized his expressions, his tone, his posture. She found reassurance in the smallest details. A pause before speaking, a lack of overt hostility, a courteous farewell. In her mind, these were signs. Her letters multiplied. She wrote to him frequently, sometimes daily, filling pages with reflections, assurances, and declarations that hovered between affection and certainty. She wrote as if continuing a conversation he had momentarily stepped away from, not one he had chosen to end. Pinson did not respond. The silence did not deter her. It empowered her imagination. Without contradiction, her interpretations flourished. She began to believe that external forces were preventing him from replying. Military discipline, social pressure, fear of scandal. His silence became proof of constraint, not disinterest. Meanwhile, her presence in England grew increasingly detached from practical reality. Money dwindled. Accommodations became less stable. She moved frequently, chasing proximity rather than comfort. Meals were skipped. Sleep grew irregular. Her life narrowed until nearly every decision revolved around a single objective: staying close to Pinson. Her family noticed her absence. Letters from Guernsey arrived expressing concern. Her mother urged her to return home. Her brothers questioned the purpose of her travels. Victor Hugo, immersed in his work, trusted that Adele would regain equilibrium on her own. After all, she had always been sensible. What no one fully grasped was that Adele was no longer navigating reality in the same way they were. Her internal logic had begun to supersede external evidence. The more resistance she encountered, the more elaborate her explanations became. She began to speak of Pinson as though their relationship existed on a different plane. Private, unspoken, understood without words. She believed they were bound by something invisible but indestructible, and if he moved again, she would follow again. When Pinson was reassigned to Ireland, Adele did not hesitate. She interpreted the transfer not as escape, But as an invitation, destiny was extending further. Ireland was poorer, rougher, less forgiving than England. Yet Adele arrived with the same unwavering certainty. She positioned herself near his postings, repeating patterns that were becoming increasingly difficult to disguise as coincidence. By now, Pinson was alarmed. He began avoiding her more deliberately. He refused meetings. He made his discomfort clear in private conversations with acquaintances. But still, he stopped short of confrontation, unsure how to extricate himself without provoking scandal or cruelty. Adele sensed his withdrawal, but she did not accept its meaning. To her, obstacles were tests. Each refusal strengthened her resolve. Each avoidance confirmed the importance of her pursuit. Love, she believed, demanded endurance, sacrifice, faith. What she did not yet understand was that faith untethered from reality becomes something else entirely. By the end of the 1850s, Adèle Hugo was no longer simply following a man. She was following a narrative, one she had authored herself, one in which she was destined to be chosen. No matter how far she had to travel or how much of herself she had to lose along the way. And soon, that journey would take her far beyond Europe, across the Atlantic. When Albert Pinson received orders for North America, he believed, finally, that distance would end everything. The posting to Halifax, Nova Scotia, was not temporary. It was decisive. An ocean now lay between him and the woman who had followed him through England and Ireland. Ignoring every signal that her presence was unwanted, Halifax was a military outpost at the edge of the British Empire, remote, cold, and far removed from European society. To Pinson, it was relief. To Adèle Hugo, it was destiny expanding its stage. She learned of his transfer through fragments of conversation and correspondence. The news struck her not as a warning, but as confirmation. If Pinson had gone so far, it must mean their story demanded a greater trial. Love, she believed, was being tested by distance, not denied by it. Crossing the Atlantic in the mid-19th century was neither simple nor comfortable. The journey took weeks. Ships pitched violently against the sea. Cabins were cramped. Illness was common, for many. The voyage alone was enough to deter pursuit. Adele did not hesitate. She framed the journey as necessary, even inevitable. She told herself, and others, that she needed a change of air, that her nerves required new surroundings. Beneath those explanations lay a belief so absolute it felt self-evident. She and Pinson were bound, and oceans were merely obstacles meant to be crossed. By the time she arrived in Halifax, her resources were already strained. The city was nothing like Paris or London. It was functional, militarized, and austere. The climate was harsh. Winters were long and unforgiving. The social life revolved almost entirely around the military. There were no salons, no intellectual circles, no familiar rhythms to ground her. But Pinson was here. That was enough. Her behavior grew bolder. She appeared at military barracks, at public events, at places where officers gathered. She approached him directly, speaking as though they shared an understanding others could not perceive. Her tone was confident, intimate, at times disturbingly certain. Pinson rejected her repeatedly, not subtly, not gently. He told her he did not love her. He told her to stop. He told her there was no future, no promise, no misunderstanding to resolve, at times. He went further, taking advantage of her devotion by accepting money, knowing she would give it willingly if she believed it brought her closer to him. Humiliation did not deter her. It deepened her conviction. Each rejection was absorbed, reshaped, and reinterpreted. She told herself he was testing her loyalty, that he was afraid, that he needed proof she would not abandon him, no matter how cruel he became. The more he pushed her away, the more she clung to the belief that their bond was extraordinary. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly. She slept little, ate irregularly. Her letters, once structured and composed, became rambling, repetitive, and insistent. She wrote not only to Pinson, but about him, filling pages with imagined conversations and future plans. At one point, she sought out a hypnotist, convinced that if Pinson could be placed into a trance, his true feelings would surface and compel him to marry her. The idea did not strike her as irrational. It felt logical. By now, even casual observers could see that something was wrong. Officers spoke quietly of her behavior. Locals avoided her. She was known to wander the streets alone, muttering to herself, lost in internal dialogue. And yet, she still believed herself to be on the verge of fulfillment. In late 1863, Adele wrote to her parents with astonishing news. She claimed she had finally married Albert Pinson, Victor Hugo. Desperate for good news after years of exile and loss, announced the marriage publicly. For a brief moment, the family allowed themselves relief. Then the truth emerged. There had been no wedding, no union, no consent. The lie was not malicious. It was delusional, even confronted with evidence. Adele did not retreat from her claim. In her mind, the marriage existed on a plane beyond paperwork and witnesses. It was real because she believed it was real. Shortly afterward, Pinson received another transfer, this time to the Caribbean, to the island of Barbados. Once again, he believed he was escaping. Once again, Adele prepared to follow. But something had changed. The journey no longer felt like pursuit. It felt like survival. By the time she boarded the ship south, Adele Hugo was no longer chasing love. She was protecting a reality that could not exist without her constant motion. If she stopped, everything would collapse. So she kept moving toward heat, isolation, and the final unraveling of what remained of her mind. Barbados was nothing like the places Adele Hugo had known. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with heat that pressed against the body without mercy. The sun burned relentlessly. The rhythms of the island, slow, cyclical, indifferent, stood in sharp contrast to the urgency that had driven her across continents. For Albert Pinson, Barbados was an ending. For Adele, it was transformation. By the time she arrived in the Caribbean, her inner world had begun to replace the external one entirely. Reality no longer corrected her beliefs, it bent around them. What could not be reconciled was simply rewritten. She referred to herself openly as Madame Pinson. There was no hesitation, no irony, no awareness that the title was unearned. To Adele, the marriage had already occurred, spiritually, emotionally, inevitably. Legal details were trivial formalities that would catch up in time. Pinson, now desperate, attempted to cut her off completely. He married another woman, Catherine Edith Roxburgh, the daughter of a senior military commander. The union was legitimate, public, and final. A child soon followed. These facts reached Adele slowly, filtered through gossip and fragmented correspondence. When she finally understood them, the impact was devastating, but not in the way one might expect. She did not accept defeat. She absorbed the information into her delusion. She told herself the marriage was a mistake, a temporary arrangement, a facade forced upon him by duty. His child was not proof of rejection. It was evidence of how deeply trapped he was. She believed she was the only one who truly understood him. On the streets of Bridgetown, Adele became a familiar sight. She wandered alone, speaking to herself, her clothes increasingly worn and unkempt, She ate infrequently. She slept poorly. Her once careful appearance deteriorated as her inner life consumed all available energy. Locals whispered about the foreign woman who drifted through town with vacant eyes and murmured conversations no one else could hear. She stopped writing regularly. The journals that had once recorded her thoughts fell silent. Letters to her family became rare, sporadic, and incoherent. In Europe, her parents could no longer trace her movements or understand her condition. Adele was alone, not merely geographically, but psychologically. When she did attempt to contact Pinson, the encounters were brief and painful. He refused to engage. He avoided her whenever possible, at times. He responded with irritation or cruelty, hoping harshness would finally sever the bond. It did not. Each dismissal reinforced her sense of tragic devotion. She cast herself as the faithful wife abandoned by circumstance, enduring suffering for love's sake. Her identity narrowed until nothing remained outside that narrative. She was no longer Adèle Hugo. She was Madame Pinson. The island offered no refuge from her mind. Without familiar structures, without family, reputation, or routine, there was nothing to slow the descent. Her hallucinations grew more vivid. She spoke of conversations that had never occurred, of promises that had never been made. At times, she appeared lucid, intelligent, articulate. At others, she was unreachable. Years passed in this state. Pinson eventually left Barbados. He returned to Europe, carrying with him the certainty that he would never see Adele again. His life moved forward. Marriage, career, respectability. Adele's did not. By the early 1870s, even her delusion began to erode under the weight of undeniable facts. Pinson's absence became permanent, his silence absolute. The narrative she had sustained through sheer belief could no longer defend itself. Something inside her finally gave way. In 1872, at the age of 41, Adèle Hugo returned to France. Not as the daughter of a literary giant, not as a woman pursuing love, but as a ghost of the person she had once been. Paris had changed. France had changed. Napoleon III was gone. Exile had ended. Victor Hugo was celebrated once again as a national hero. But when Adele stood before her father, he barely recognized her. She spoke strangely. She drifted in and out of coherence. She referenced events that had never happened and relationships that had never existed. The daughter who had once played piano in quiet rooms now lived in fragments of memory and delusion. Victor Hugo, devastated and helpless, made the decision he had long avoided. Adele was committed to an asylum, first Saint-Mandé, then Suresnes, institutions on the outskirts of Paris where she would spend the remainder of her life. There, doctors observed symptoms consistent with severe schizophrenia, hallucinations, disordered thought, emotional withdrawal, and yet, she was not always lost. Visitors later recalled moments of clarity. She spoke fondly of her father. She remembered music. She read obsessively, French, Latin, Greek. She played piano when allowed, her hands still capable of beauty even as her mind fractured. Victor Hugo supported her until his death in 1885. Adele outlived him by 30 years. She died on April 21, 1915, at the age of 84. She was buried in Villequier, near the river where Léopoldine had drowned so many decades earlier, her life closing where its deepest wound had first been opened. Albert Pinson died only months later. Their lives never reunited, but their names would remain bound forever, not by love, but by obsession, illness, and the fragile line between longing and madness. When Adèle Hugo returned to France in 1872, the country she stepped into was not the one she had left behind. Paris had survived revolution, empire, war, and collapse. Napoleon III was gone. His reign ended in humiliation during the Franco-Prussian War. The Republic had returned. Streets once watched by imperial police now celebrated Republican ideals. France was rebuilding its identity. And standing at the edge of that rebirth was a woman who could no longer recognize herself. Adele arrived quietly. There were no crowds, no scandal, no headlines announcing her return. She did not come home as a prodigal daughter or a tragic romantic heroine. She came back exhausted, disoriented, and psychologically fragmented, her body present, her mind elsewhere. Victor Hugo had returned to Paris as well, after nearly 20 years of exile. He was welcomed not merely as a writer, but as a symbol. Crowds gathered to see him. His name carried the weight of conscience and national pride. He was celebrated, honored, listened to. But when he saw his daughter, all of that fell away. Adele was 41 years old, but she looked older. Her posture was uncertain. Her speech wandered. She spoke of people and events that did not align with reality. She referenced Albert Pinson casually, as though he were still part of her life, still connected to her in ways that required no explanation. At first, Victor hoped she was simply exhausted. He told himself that years of travel, emotional strain, and isolation had taken their toll. That rest, familiarity, and family would restore her. He had seen grief destroy him once before, after Leopoldine's death, and he believed the mind could recover if given time. But time revealed something far more troubling. Adele drifted in and out of lucidity. Some days, she spoke clearly, intelligently, even warmly. She remembered Paris salons, old acquaintances, music she loved. She played piano with surprising sensitivity, her fingers recalling patterns her mind could not fully explain. Other days, she was unreachable. She stared for hours. She spoke to people who were not there. She confused past and present, truth and invention. She did not recognize visitors she had known for decades, and when she spoke of her life abroad, it was not as it had been, but as she had believed it to be. Victor Hugo began to understand what he had long avoided. This was not heartbreak. This was not eccentricity. This was illness. Doctors were consulted. Observations were made. The language of the time was imprecise. Madness, melancholia, mania, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Hallucinations, delusions, emotional withdrawal, disordered thought. What modern medicine would later identify as schizophrenia had already taken firm hold. Victor faced an impossible choice. To keep Adele at home meant constant supervision, confusion, and the risk that her condition would worsen without structure. To place her in care meant acknowledging publicly that his daughter, the child of genius, culture, and privilege, had been irreparably broken. Love did not make the decision easier. It made it heavier. In the end, Victor chose safety over pride. Adele was committed first to Saint-Mandé, then later to Suresnes, quiet institutions on the outskirts of Paris. They were not prisons, but they were not homes either. Life there moved slowly, deliberately, stripped of urgency and expectation, for Adele. The transition was oddly gentle. The outside world had already begun to fade. The asylum did not feel like confinement so much as confirmation that her internal reality was no longer compatible with the external one. There, removed from travel and pursuit. Her obsessions softened but did not disappear. She no longer followed Albert Pinson across oceans. But his presence lingered in her thoughts like an echo that refused to die completely. And yet, something unexpected happened. She stabilized, not cured, not restored, but steadied. She read obsessively, French, Latin, Greek. She spoke of composers she loved, of music that still moved her. She played piano when allowed, losing herself in sound rather than memory. At times, she spoke with clarity and even humor, recalling her father with affection rather than longing. Visitors later described her as gentle, quiet, distant, but not entirely lost. Victor Hugo visited when he could. He supported her financially and emotionally until his death in 1885. By then, Adele was the only one of his 5 children still alive. She outlived them all. Adele Hugo would spend more than 4 decades in institutional care, longer than she had lived freely. She died on April 21st, 1915, at the age of 84, in a world utterly transformed from the one she had been born into. She was buried in Villequier, near the river that had claimed Léopoldine so many years earlier. Her life closed where its deepest wound had first been opened. Not with scandal, not with romance, but with silence. Time moved differently inside the asylum, at Saint-Mandé, and later Suresnes. Days were measured not by ambition or progress, but by routine. Meals arrived at fixed hours. Walks were supervised. Silence was encouraged. The outside world, politics, literature, revolution, faded into irrelevance behind stone walls and locked doors. For Adele Hugo, this was not entirely a punishment. It was a narrowing. The chaos that had driven her across oceans was gone. There were no ships to catch, no addresses to trace, no footsteps to follow. The endless motion that had sustained her delusion had finally stopped. At first, she resisted. She spoke of Albert Pinson as though he might arrive any day. She insisted on her title, Madame Pinson, with quiet certainty. Doctors listened patiently, taking notes, offering no contradiction strong enough to shatter her beliefs, but enough to ground her daily life. Over time, the intensity softened, not because the delusion disappeared, but because it lost momentum, without constant pursuit. It could no longer feed on distance or anticipation. The belief remained, but it grew quieter, less urgent, less consuming. Adele settled into the rhythms of institutional life. She read constantly. Books became her primary connection to coherence. She moved easily between French, Latin, and Greek, languages that allowed her to exist within structure and order. Unlike human relationships, texts did not reject her. They waited patiently, offering meaning without contradiction. Music remained her refuge, when permitted. She played the piano with surprising control. Nurses and attendants would pause in corridors, listening. The sound carried something unmistakable. Sadness. Yes, but also discipline, memory, restraint. Her hands remembered what her mind often could not. Visitors described moments of lucidity that felt almost miraculous. On good days, Adele spoke calmly about her childhood in Paris, about the salons her father had hosted, about artists and writers she had known. She asked polite questions. She smiled. She appeared, briefly, whole. On bad days, she withdrew completely. She stared through windows as if waiting for something to appear. She murmured fragments of conversations that had never happened. She failed to recognize faces she should have known. Time folded in on itself, collapsing past and present into a single, indistinct blur. Doctors noted the pattern but could not change it. Treatment in the late 19th century offered containment, not cure. There were no medications capable of addressing hallucinations or delusions. Care focused on stability, safety, and dignity, preventing harm rather than restoring identity. Victor Hugo understood this. He visited when his schedule allowed, though his public life increasingly demanded his presence elsewhere. When he came, Adele sometimes recognized him immediately, speaking with warmth and affection. Other times, she treated him like a courteous stranger. Each visit carried uncertainty. Victor never reproached her, never questioned her beliefs directly. He spoke gently, asking about her reading, her music. He brought books. He ensured she was cared for financially and materially. In public, he remained the towering figure of French literature. In private, he was a father watching his child slip further beyond reach. When Victor Hugo died in 1885, the nation mourned. Millions attended his funeral. France honored him as a moral and cultural giant. Adele was not present. By then, she was the only surviving child of Victor Hugo. Léopoldine, Charles, François Victor, all gone. The family that had once been filled with voices had narrowed to a single. Fragile existence behind institutional walls. News of her father's death reached Adele slowly. Some accounts suggest she understood and grieved. Others imply she barely registered it, her mind already untethered from linear narrative. What is clear is that she continued on much as before, reading, playing music, drifting between clarity and confusion. Years passed. Decades. The world outside transformed beyond recognition. Empires collapsed. New technologies reshaped daily life. The First World War erupted, tearing Europe apart. Inside the asylum, time barely acknowledged these changes. Adele aged quietly. Her hair whitened. Her movement slowed. Her episodes of lucidity became less frequent but did not disappear entirely. Those who met her late in life described a woman who was gentle, introspective, and strangely peaceful, no longer driven by obsession, no longer chasing an impossible future. In April 1915, at the age of 84, Adèle Hugo died. There was no spectacle. She was buried in Villequier, near the river that had taken Léopoldine so many years earlier. The circle closed not with resolution, but with symmetry. A life shaped by loss returning to its origin. Albert Pinson died only months later. They never reunited. They never reconciled. Their connection existed entirely within Adele's mind and within history's record of how obsession, illness, and emotional neglect can intertwine to devastating effect. Adèle Hugo did not live a love story. She lived a warning. A reminder that brilliance does not protect against fragility, that proximity to genius does not guarantee understanding, and that when longing goes unseen for too long, it can transform into something unrecognizable. For many years after her death, Adèle Hugo existed only as a footnote. She was remembered, when she was remembered at all, as the mad daughter, a tragic curiosity attached to a famous name. Biographers of Victor Hugo mentioned her briefly, often cautiously, sometimes dismissively. Her life was treated as an embarrassment, a deviation from the grandeur of her father's legacy. It was easier that way. To acknowledge Adele fully meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. That genius does not shield families from neglect. That brilliance can coexist with blindness, and that emotional abandonment can be just as destructive as overt cruelty. Victor Hugo loved his daughter. There is no serious doubt about that. But love, when filtered through distance, expectation, and distraction, can still fail. Adele's illness was not caused by a single event, not by Albert Pinson alone, not by exile, not even by the death of Léopoldine, devastating as it was. Her descent was the result of accumulation. Small fractures layered over time, left unaddressed because they were quiet, because they did not disrupt others. She was compliant. She was sensitive. She did not demand space, and so she disappeared slowly, long before she ever followed a man across oceans. In the early 20th century, attitudes toward mental illness began to change. Psychiatrists revisited historical cases, searching for patterns that had once been misunderstood. Adèle Hugo's journals, letters, and hospital records were re-examined. What had once been labeled madness came to be understood as schizophrenia, likely hereditary. Her paternal uncle, Eugene Hugo, had suffered similar symptoms after emotional trauma. This reframing did not absolve the suffering, but it gave it context. Adele was not a romantic heroine driven mad by love, nor a villainous stalker defined by obsession alone. She was a woman whose mind fractured under the weight of unresolved grief, isolation, and a desperate need for attachment, conditions that, left untreated, turned longing into delusion. In 1975, her story re-entered public consciousness through cinema. French New Wave director François Truffaut released the story of Adele H., starring a young Isabelle Adjani. The film portrayed Adele not as a spectacle, but as a human being, vulnerable, obsessive, aching for connection. Adjani's performance was haunting, restrained, and deeply unsettling. She was nominated for an Academy Award, the youngest actress ever to receive the honor at that time. Audiences were disturbed, not by violence, not by scandal, but by recognition. Adele's story resonated because it revealed something universal: the terror of loving without being seen, of needing someone to confirm your existence, and what happens when that need is never met. In the decades that followed, historians and writers continued to return to her life. Letters once dismissed as incoherent were read as documents of psychological collapse. Her journals became evidence not of delusion alone, but of awareness struggling to survive inside illness. She loved music. She loved language. She remembered beauty even when she could not sustain reality. This complexity resists easy categorization. Was Adele Hugo a victim? Yes. Was Albert Pinson a villain? Not entirely. Was Victor Hugo responsible? In part, but not in the way history often wants responsibility to look. The truth is quieter and more unsettling. Adele Hugo fell through the cracks not because no one cared, but because no one knew how to care for someone like her. She lived at a time when emotional needs were dismissed, when women's inner lives were minimized, and when mental illness was contained rather than understood. Her obsession was visible. Her pain was not. Today, her story is often told as a warning about stalking, delusion, and untreated mental illness. And it should be, but it is also something else. A reminder that psychological collapse rarely announces itself loudly at first. It begins in silence, in accommodation, in unmet longing. Adele Hugo lived 84 years. More than half of them were spent inside institutions. Yet even there, even at the margins of history and reason, she remained human, capable of memory, music, and moments of clarity that cut through the fog. She was buried near the Seine, close to where Léopoldine had drowned. The river that had first taught her what loss felt like stood quietly at the end of her story. No inscription could summarize her life accurately. She was not simply the daughter of Victor Hugo. She was not merely a woman who loved too much. She was not just a patient, or a case, or a cautionary tale. She was Adele Hugo, a woman born into genius, starved of certainty, and ultimately consumed by a world that never learned how to hold her. Long after Adele Hugo's death, her story refused to stay buried. At first, it resurfaced quietly. Academic papers, footnotes in biographies, cautious references in psychiatric journals. Scholars debated timelines, diagnoses, responsibility. Was her illness inherited, triggered by trauma, accelerated by exile and emotional neglect? But outside those circles, the public remembered something else. They remembered the obsession in popular retellings. Adele was flattened into a single image, A woman who followed a man across oceans, who refused to accept rejection, who lost her mind for love. It was a simpler story, and simplicity is seductive. By the mid-20th century, the language surrounding her life began to shift. What 19th century doctors had called madness was now discussed as mental illness. Her letters, once dismissed as incoherent rambling, were reread as documentation of a mind unraveling in real time. Still, fascination lingered, not because people understood her better, but because her story sat at the uncomfortable intersection of romance and horror in an age that increasingly questioned obsession, boundaries, and consent. Adèle Hugo felt disturbingly modern. She was not violent. She did not threaten. She did not destroy others' lives directly. And yet, her pursuit was relentless. This ambiguity made her difficult to categorize and impossible to ignore. In 1975, nearly 60 years after her death, French director François Truffaut brought her story to the screen with The Story of Adele H. The film stripped away sensationalism and focused instead on psychological deterioration. There were no villains, no dramatic confrontations, only the slow suffocation of a woman trapped inside her own certainty. Isabelle Adjani, just 20 years old, embodied Adele with unnerving restraint. Her performance unsettled audiences not through spectacle, but through proximity. Viewers did not watch Adele from a distance. They were forced inside her mind. Where logic dissolved and devotion hardened into delusion, the film was critically acclaimed. It was also deeply uncomfortable, because it asked a question few stories dare to ask plainly. At what point does love stop being love? In the decades that followed, Adèle Hugo's life was re-examined again and again by historians, psychologists, feminists, and true crime writers. Each interpretation revealed more about the era examining her than about Adele herself. To some, she was a victim of patriarchy and neglect. To others, a warning about untreated mental illness. To a modern audience, she resembled something newly familiar, a real person whose private breakdown became public spectacle. Her story began to circulate online, reframed in harsher language: stalker, delusional, dangerous. But those labels, while not entirely false, remain incomplete. What they miss is the absence of intervention. No one stopped Adele, not because no one noticed, but because her suffering did not disrupt social order until it was too late. She was wealthy, educated, polite. Her obsession harmed primarily herself, and so it was tolerated, minimized, explained away. By the time it became undeniable, there was nothing left to prevent, only to contain. Today, Adèle Hugo's life sits uneasily within modern conversations about mental health, consent, and responsibility. She forces us to confront a reality we still struggle to face. That untreated psychological illness does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like devotion, like persistence, like a woman who simply refuses to let go. And that is what makes her story endure. Not the distance she traveled, not the famous father, not even the man she followed, but the slow realization that a human mind can build an entire reality around one belief, and that once built, it becomes almost impossible to dismantle from the outside. Adèle Hugo did not chase love. She chased certainty, and in a world that never gave it to her, she created her own, one that ultimately consumed her life. If Adèle Hugo were alive today, her story would unfold very differently, not because her pain would vanish, but because the language around it would change. What 19th century society labeled madness, modern psychology recognizes as severe mental illness shaped by environment, trauma, and unmet emotional needs. Her behavior, once framed as tragic romance or moral failure, would now raise urgent clinical alarms. And yet, that recognition comes with discomfort. Because when Adele's life is viewed through a modern lens, it forces us to confront questions we still struggle to answer. Where does obsession end and illness begin? When does sympathy give way to accountability? And who is responsible when someone's inner world collapses in plain sight? From a contemporary psychological standpoint, Adèle Hugo exhibited classic signs of erotomanic delusion, a condition in which an individual becomes convinced that another person is secretly in love with them. Despite clear evidence to the contrary, the belief is not metaphorical. It is not symbolic. It is absolute. To challenge it directly often makes it stronger. This is why Albert Pinson's repeated rejections failed to stop her in her mind. Rejection was not denial. It was disguise. Silence was not absence. It was constraint. Every contradiction was reinterpreted as proof of deeper connection. Modern clinicians recognize this pattern immediately. But recognition alone does not solve the moral tension. Because Adele was not violent, she did not threaten Pinson. She did not seek revenge. She pursued, relentlessly, intrusively, and destructively, but always under the conviction that she was acting within a shared emotional reality. This is what makes her story so difficult to place neatly within modern narratives of stalking or victimhood. Albert Pinson was a victim of harassment. Adèle Hugo was a victim of illness. Both truths coexist, and between them lies a space where society failed to intervene meaningfully. In the 19th century, there were few mechanisms for early psychiatric care, especially for women of privilege whose behavior did not immediately endanger others. Adele's wealth, education, and famous name insulated her. Her suffering was interpreted as eccentricity, sensitivity, heartbreak. By the time her condition became undeniable, intervention meant confinement, not healing. Even today, the same pattern persists. People often do not receive help until their behavior becomes disruptive, threatening, or impossible to ignore. Quiet deterioration is still overlooked. Obsession that harms primarily the self is still minimized. Emotional distress that presents as devotion is still romanticized. Adèle Hugo's life exposes this blind spot. She reminds us that mental illness does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives wearing the language of love, faith, and persistence. Sometimes it is tolerated precisely because it looks like commitment. Modern retellings often struggle with this ambiguity. True crime narratives tend to flatten complexity. They seek villains, victims, turning points. But Adele's story resists that structure. There is no single moment where everything could have been stopped. No dramatic intervention that would have reversed her trajectory. Her collapse was gradual. It unfolded across years of silence, misinterpretation, and emotional isolation. From a contemporary ethical perspective, responsibility disperses rather than concentrates. Victor Hugo failed to see the depth of his daughter's distress, but he lived in an era without language for it. Albert Pinson failed to confront the situation decisively, but doing so may not have helped and might have worsened it. Society failed to intervene, but society rarely intervenes early. Even now, and Adele herself, she bears responsibility only in the narrow sense that her actions caused harm. But moral blame collapses under the weight of delusion. One cannot choose to exit a reality one cannot perceive as false. This is why her story continues to disturb modern audiences, not because it is exotic or historical, but because it is familiar. We recognize versions of Adele everywhere, in unchecked fixation, in emotional dependence framed as loyalty, in suffering dismissed until it becomes unbearable. Her life forces us to ask not only what happened to her, but what is happening now, all around us, in quieter forms. Adele Hugo's tragedy was not inevitable, but it was predictable. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all, more than a century after her death. Adele Hugo continues to unsettle us, not because her story is strange, but because it is disturbingly recognizable. Strip away the 19th century setting, the famous surname, the letters written in ink instead of text messages, and what remains feels uncomfortably modern. A person constructing meaning around another human being until that meaning becomes the only thing holding them together. Adele's life lingers because it refuses to stay safely in the past. We like to believe that history is a collection of outdated mistakes, errors corrected by progress, but Adele exposes a flaw that has not disappeared: our inability to respond early, compassionately, and decisively to psychological collapse when it does not look dramatic enough to demand attention. Her obsession did not begin with pursuit, it began with emptiness. A childhood defined by emotional distance. A household where brilliance overshadowed sensitivity. Losses that were absorbed rather than processed. A young woman taught to endure quietly rather than ask directly. By the time Albert Pinson entered her life, the conditions were already set. He did not create the fracture. He became the structure around which it organized itself. This is what makes Adele Hugo frightening in retrospect. She did not act irrationally all at once. She reasoned. She adapted. She justified. Her internal logic was consistent, even elegant, if one accepted its first premise, that she was loved. Once that belief was locked in place, everything else followed naturally. Distance became proof. Rejection became disguise. Silence became sacrifice. Reality itself bent to preserve the idea that gave her existence coherence. This pattern is not rare. We see it today in relationships built on projection rather than reciprocity, in emotional dependence framed as destiny, in people who mistake intensity for truth and persistence for meaning. Adele Hugo forces us to confront a difficult truth. The human mind will choose a false certainty over unbearable ambiguity. And once chosen, it will defend that certainty at extraordinary cost. Her story also endures because it complicates our moral instincts. Modern audiences are quick to categorize victim or perpetrator, romantic or stalker, tragic or dangerous. Adele resists these binaries. She was intrusive and suffering, harmful and harmed, responsible in action, but impaired in perception. This ambiguity is uncomfortable. It denies us the satisfaction of judgment. Instead, it leaves us with questions that have no clean answers. Questions about how much autonomy exists inside illness, about when intervention becomes necessary, and who has the authority to decide, about how many lives unravel not because no one cared, but because caring was passive, delayed, or misdirected. Adele Hugo did not fall through the cracks because she was invisible. She fell because she was quiet. Her pain did not disrupt society. It disrupted only herself. And that, historically, has never been enough to justify urgency. Even today, we often wait for escalation before response. We tolerate suffering until it becomes dangerous, public, or undeniable. By then, containment replaces prevention, just as it did for Adele. That is why her life feels less like a historical tragedy and more like a mirror. She haunts us because she reveals how easily obsession can masquerade as devotion, how readily delusion can wear the language of love, and how slow we are to intervene when someone's inner collapse does not immediately threaten others. She also haunts us because, despite everything, she remained human. She read, she remembered music, she experienced moments of clarity and kindness, even after decades in institutions. She was not erased, only narrowed, her mind fractured, but it never vanished entirely. That persistence complicates the narrative of madness. It reminds us that mental illness does not erase identity, it distorts it. What remains is not absence, but struggle. Adele Hugo's life does not ask us to excuse her actions. It asks us to understand the conditions that made them possible, and perhaps more importantly, it asks us to look around at the quieter forms of obsession, loneliness, and untreated distress that still surround us, and consider how many Adeles exist now, moving unnoticed toward private catastrophes. Her story endures not because it is sensational. It endures because it is unfinished, repeating itself in new forms, under new names, in a world that still struggles to recognize suffering before it hardens into something irreversible. Adele Hugo does not haunt us because she followed a man across oceans. She haunts us because she shows how easily a human being can lose reality when reality never offered a place to belong. By the time Adele Hugo reached old age, the world no longer expected anything from her. Expectations, those invisible forces that had once shaped her life so powerfully, had dissolved. No one waited for her recovery. No one feared her next move. No one imagined a future in which she would return to society as she once had been. She existed in a long afterward, inside the asylum at Nice. Days unfolded with gentle indifference. Nurses came and went. Seasons changed without ceremony. The war raging across Europe reached her only as distant rumor, stripped of urgency by thick walls and institutional routine. Adele was no longer dangerous. She was no longer disruptive. She was no longer even particularly remarkable. And yet, she was still there. Those who encountered her in her later years often remarked on the contradiction. She did not appear violent or wild. She was soft-spoken, polite, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes unexpectedly articulate. She asked about music. She spoke fondly of composers long dead. She read with a concentration that bordered on reverence. At times, she seemed almost peaceful. This calm unsettled observers more than her earlier obsession ever had, because it suggested something difficult to accept, that a human being could lose nearly everything: identity, autonomy, future, and still continue living, quietly adapting to the smallest possible version of existence. The delusions did not vanish completely. They faded. Albert Pinson no longer dominated her speech, but his presence lingered like a shadow behind other thoughts, a name that surfaced occasionally, without intensity, without urgency, as if even obsession, when starved long enough, eventually exhausted itself. Memory became selective. Some days, Adele recalled her childhood vividly: Paris salons, the sound of her father's voice, the weight of books in her hands. Other days, those memories fractured, rearranged themselves, or disappeared entirely. Time was no longer linear. It folded inward, creating a present that floated free of sequence. Visitors learned not to correct her. Correction caused distress. Acceptance allowed calm. This, too, was a kind of mercy. When Victor Hugo died in 1885, Adele was already far removed from the world that mourned him. She did not attend the funeral that drew millions into the streets of Paris. The nation grieved the loss of a giant. Adele grieved, or did not, in private. If she understood the permanence of his absence, it did not manifest outwardly. Some accounts suggest she asked after him long afterward. Others suggest she spoke of him in the present tense, as though he remained simply elsewhere, busy with his work, in a way. She was not wrong. Victor Hugo lived on everywhere except where she was. Years turned into decades. Doctors changed. Institutions evolved slightly. Treatments improved marginally, though not enough to restore what had been lost. Adele aged into invisibility. Her once noted beauty gave way to fragility. Her movements slowed. Her voice softened further. She became, finally, a person without narrative momentum. No pursuit, no decline, no transformation, just continuation. On April 21st, 1915, Adèle Hugo died. There was no dramatic moment, no final revelation, no last confession that clarified her life. Death came quietly, as it often does for those long removed from urgency. She was 84 years old. The world she left behind barely noticed. Europe was consumed by war. Empires were collapsing. Millions were dying. Against that scale, the passing of a woman institutionalized for decades carried little weight. She was buried in Villequier, near the Seine, near the place where Léopoldine had drowned, where grief had first torn a permanent hole in her life. The choice of burial was symbolic, whether intentional or not. Her story ended where it had truly begun. Albert Pinson died later that same year. There was no reunion in death, no poetic convergence. History did not offer that kind of symmetry. Their lives intersected only once, briefly, disastrously, and then moved in opposite directions forever. What remained was not a love story, but a record of how obsession can replace identity, of how silence can be mistaken for stability, of how society often responds only after damage has become irreversible. Adele Hugo's life did not conclude with understanding. It concluded with quiet. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of all. Not that her story was tragic, but that it faded without resolution, absorbed into history without ceremony, leaving behind questions that still have no clear answers. How early could she have been helped? What would intervention have looked like? How many similar lives unfold now, unnoticed, because suffering has learned how to stay polite? Adele Hugo does not offer closure. She offers a warning that remains unresolved. Adele Hugo's life does not end neatly, and neither does its meaning. If her story feels unresolved, it is because it mirrors a truth we still struggle to confront. Human suffering rarely arrives with clear signals, and it almost never announces when it has crossed the point of no return. Looking back, it is tempting to isolate the moments that seem decisive: the death of Léopoldine, the exile from France, the meeting with Albert Pinson, but focusing on single events obscures the larger reality. Adele's collapse was not caused by one tragedy or one man. It was shaped by patterns, emotional neglect mistaken for independence, sensitivity praised but unsupported, silence interpreted as strength. She learned early that being low maintenance was safer than being demanding, that longing should be endured quietly, that love, when withheld, must be earned rather than questioned. These lessons did not destroy her on their own. They simply prepared the ground. When obsession arrived, it did not feel foreign. It felt like purpose, from a modern perspective. This is perhaps the most important insight her life offers. Mental illness often attaches itself to something meaningful. It does not always appear as chaos. Sometimes it presents as devotion, faith, perseverance, the very traits societies admire when they remain within acceptable limits. Adele's fixation was tolerated for so long precisely because it resembled commitment, because it looked like romance rather than pathology, because it inconvenienced no one with power until it was already entrenched. Even today, this pattern repeats. We intervene quickly when suffering is loud, disruptive, or violent. We hesitate when it is quiet, inward, self-sacrificing. We are slower to respond when pain disguises itself as loyalty, when distress is expressed through endurance rather than collapse. Adele Hugo forces us to ask, How many lives deteriorate slowly because they do not violate social norms loudly enough to trigger concern? Her story also complicates the modern instinct to assign blame. It would be easy to cast Victor Hugo as the inattentive father, Albert Pinson as the cruel object of obsession, 19th century society as willfully ignorant. Each played a role. None alone explains the outcome. Responsibility in cases like Adele's is diffuse. It lives in systems that lack language for vulnerability, in cultures that reward stoicism over honesty, in families that mistake silence for stability, and it lives, uncomfortably, in the limits of what love alone can fix. Victor Hugo loved his daughter. He supported her financially. He did not abandon her. But love, without understanding, could not reach the illness shaping her reality. When intervention finally came, it arrived as confinement rather than care, because that was all the era could offer. This, too, remains relevant, even with modern medicine. Access to early, compassionate mental health care is uneven. People still fall through gaps, not because no one notices, but because noticing does not always lead to action, because action is costly, complicated, and often delayed until danger becomes undeniable. Adele's life also challenges how we tell stories. We are drawn to extremes, obsession, madness, tragedy, but focusing on spectacle risks missing the quieter lesson. The most important parts of her story did not happen during ocean crossings or public humiliations. They happened earlier, in drawing rooms and sick rooms, in moments where emotional needs were minimized because they did not look urgent. Her descent was not dramatic until it was irreversible. That is why her life continues to resonate. She does not represent an anomaly. She represents a possibility, a reminder that meaning is something the human mind will construct at all costs, and that when the external world offers too little, the internal world may compensate in ways that become dangerous. Adele Hugo did not lack intelligence. She did not lack culture. She did not lack sensitivity. She lacked grounding, a stable emotional framework strong enough to withstand loss, rejection, and ambiguity. Without it, obsession became structure. Delusion became shelter. And once those structures formed, dismantling them required tools that did not yet exist. What her life teaches us now is not how to judge obsession, but how to recognize the conditions that give rise to it, how to listen earlier, how to take quiet distress seriously, how to intervene before certainty hardens into something unbreakable. Her story does not ask for pity, it asks for attention. Because as long as we continue to overlook suffering that presents politely, Adele Hugo's life will not remain history. It will remain prophecy. There is no single sentence that can close Adele Hugo's life. Stories like hers resist conclusions because they were never moving toward resolution in the first place. They were moving toward endurance, toward survival in the narrowest sense of the word. Adele did not die young. She did not burn out in a final dramatic act. She lived, and that is what makes her story so difficult to leave behind. We are conditioned to understand tragedy as something brief and explosive, a fall, a moment, a point of no return. But Adele's life reminds us that some tragedies unfold slowly, quietly, across decades, so gradually that they begin to feel normal to those watching from the outside. Her suffering did not end when she was institutionalized. It stabilized. It settled. It became manageable enough to be ignored. And in that state, she lived longer than most of the people who had shaped her fate. She outlived her siblings. She outlived her father. She outlived the century that had formed her. By the time she died in 1915, the world had reinvented itself many times over. Empires rose and collapsed. Technologies transformed daily life. Ideas that once felt radical became obsolete. But Adele remained, untethered from progress, preserved in a psychological landscape that never advanced beyond the moment where her reality split in two. This is the quiet horror at the center of her story. Not that she lost her mind, but that life continued anyway. She read books written by people long dead. She played music composed for rooms she would never sit in again. She remembered fragments of a world that no longer existed, and for decades. That was enough. When people speak of Adèle Hugo today, they often ask what could have saved her. Better medicine? Earlier intervention? A different family dynamic? A different man? These questions matter, but they also miss something essential. Because even with all the answers we have now, we still struggle to act on them. We still overlook quiet suffering. We still romanticize endurance. We still confuse devotion with health. And we still wait too long to intervene when pain does not immediately threaten others. Adèle Hugo is not a story about the past failing someone primitive and uneducated. She is a story about how easy it is to miss collapse when it wears the mask of composure. She was well-mannered. She was articulate. She came from privilege and culture. Nothing about her early distress demanded urgency until urgency was no longer enough. That is why her story remains relevant. Not because obsession is rare, not because mental illness is mysterious, but because recognition does not automatically lead to responsibility. Understanding does not guarantee action. Adele's life asks us a final, uncomfortable question. If we had been there, really there, would we have done anything differently? Or would we, too, have waited until her reality became impossible to share? There is no moral triumph at the end of her story. No redemption arc. No lesson that neatly resolves the damage. There is only awareness. Awareness that human beings will cling to meaning even when it destroys them. Awareness that silence can be mistaken for strength. Awareness that some lives are lost not to violence or catastrophe, but to neglect that never looks cruel enough to stop. Adèle Hugo does not need to be remembered as a stalker, a madwoman, or a cautionary tale. She deserves to be remembered as what she was, a human being whose need for certainty went unanswered for too long. And if her story leaves us unsettled, that may be its final purpose, because the moment we stop feeling unsettled by lives like hers is the moment we guarantee that they will keep happening. Adèle Hugo did not choose to become a story. For most of her life, she resisted visibility, even at the height of her obsession. She moved through the world quietly, without spectacle or confrontation. There were no public scenes, no crimes, no dramatic confessions meant for an audience. Her suffering unfolded in letters, in waiting rooms, in rented rooms near barracks, places history rarely preserves. And yet, after her death, visibility arrived anyway. It began slowly. Family papers were sorted, letters were archived, journals, once dismissed as incoherent, were read again with different eyes. What had seemed like disordered writing now appeared as a mind documenting its own collapse. Line by line, without realizing it was doing so, scholars noticed patterns, psychiatrists noticed symptoms, biographers noticed omissions. Adèle Hugo was no longer just Victor Hugo's daughter. She was becoming a case study. This transformation, from private tragedy to public narrative, raised a new set of questions. Who has the right to interpret a life that could not defend itself? Where does understanding end and exploitation begin? And what is lost when suffering becomes material for analysis? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the dominant impulse was explanation. Adele's life was dissected to illuminate heredity, pathology, and the limits of romanticism. Her fixation on Albert Pinson was often foregrounded at the expense of everything else, as though obsession alone could summarize decades of existence. This narrowing was convenient. It offered a single cause, a single turning point, a single cautionary theme, but it also repeated the original mistake that had shaped her life, reducing complexity to something manageable. As psychology matured, so did the story told about her. The language softened. Moral judgment gave way to clinical framing. Terms like erotomania and schizophrenia replaced madness and hysteria. Adele became less a failure of character and more a failure of systems, familial, social, medical. Yet even this reframing carried risks. To medicalize her completely was to erase her interiority, to turn her into a diagnosis rather than a person. Her love of music, her intellectual curiosity, her moments of clarity, these details often disappeared beneath the weight of terminology. Then came art. Art did what analysis could not. When filmmakers, novelists, and playwrights encountered Adele's life, they were drawn not to her diagnosis, but to her inner logic. They explored the emotional coherence of her delusion, the way her beliefs, while false, formed a consistent world that protected her from unbearable uncertainty. In these retellings, Adele was no longer merely observed. She was inhabited. This shift mattered. It moved the conversation away from spectacle and toward empathy. Not sympathy, not excuse, but recognition. Audiences were no longer asked to judge her actions from a distance. They were asked to feel how inevitable those actions might have felt from the inside. And that is where discomfort returned. Because when Adele's life is told well, it does not reassure, it destabilizes. It blurs lines we prefer to keep sharp: sanity and madness, agency and illness, love and harm. It asks viewers and readers to acknowledge how thin those boundaries can be under the right conditions. This is why her story resurfaces again and again. Not because it offers clear lessons, but because it refuses to settle. Each generation retells Adèle Hugo differently, shaped by its own anxieties, to some. She is a warning about obsession. To others, a symbol of women constrained by silence. To others, still, an early example of untreated severe mental illness misunderstood as romance. None of these interpretations are wrong. None of them are complete. Adele's life resists closure because it was never allowed resolution. It unfolded under observation, but without intervention. It was explained after the fact, but rarely addressed in the moment. The stories told about her now are, in some sense, attempts to do retroactively what could not be done then, to pay attention. But attention, even when sincere, cannot change the outcome. It can only shape memory, and memory, once shaped, becomes responsibility. The question is no longer what happened to Adèle Hugo. The question is what we do with her story now, whether we flatten it into warning or allow it to remain complex, unresolved, and demanding of deeper thought. Because how we remember her determines whether her life becomes merely content or remains a challenge to how we recognize suffering while it is still unfolding. When Adèle Hugo's life entered the realm of art, something subtle and risky occurred. Art does not simply preserve stories, it reshapes them. Pain becomes narrative, suffering becomes structure, and the messiness of real lives is often smoothed into something emotionally legible. This transformation is not inherently cruel. In many cases, it is the only way forgotten lives are remembered at all. But in Adele's case, it introduced a moral tension that is never fully resolved. How do we tell a story about obsession and mental illness without turning it into romance? The line is thinner than we like to admit. When Adele's pursuit of Albert Pinson is framed as tragic devotion, Audiences are tempted to read her collapse as the cost of loving too deeply. When her endurance is emphasized without context, persistence begins to resemble virtue. When her delusions are rendered poetically, they risk being mistaken for insight. Art thrives on intensity. Illness provides it abundantly. This is why Adele's story is so often misunderstood. Romantic narratives prefer passion to pathology. They favor inner fire over structural neglect. They compress years of deterioration into a single emotional arc. Desire, rejection, madness, because it feels familiar, dramatic, consumable. But reality is slower. Adele did not spiral because she loved too much. She spiraled because her emotional world lacked grounding long before love arrived. When art isolates her obsession from its context, it reproduces the very misunderstanding that allowed her condition to progress unchecked. It turns illness into identity and fixation into fate. This does not mean her story should not be told artistically. It means it must be told carefully. Ethical storytelling requires resistance to simplification. It asks creators to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it, to show how obsession can feel purposeful from within while remaining destructive from without, to acknowledge harm without assigning villainy where illness distorts agency. Adele Hugo's life tests these boundaries relentlessly. Albert Pinson is often flattened into a heartless antagonist, or erased entirely. Victor Hugo is alternately sanctified or condemned. Adele herself becomes either martyr or menace. These distortions make the story easier to digest, but less truthful. Truth is more uncomfortable. Pinson was neither monster nor hero. He was a man unequipped to handle being the object of a delusion. His avoidance was human. His cruelty, when it appeared, was a response to fear and exhaustion, not malice. Victor Hugo was neither absent nor attentive enough. He loved deeply, but from a distance shaped by era, ego, and obligation. He failed not through indifference, but through misunderstanding. And Adele? She was not a romantic ideal undone by love. She was a person whose illness attached itself to meaning because meaning was scarce elsewhere. Art that honors her story must hold all of this at once. This is difficult work. It resists spectacle. It asks audiences to remain uncomfortable, denied the relief of clear judgment or emotional catharsis. It challenges the seductive myth that suffering ennobles. That obsession is just passion misunderstood. The risk of romanticizing pain is not theoretical. When stories like Adele's are stripped of context, they reinforce harmful beliefs that devotion excuses intrusion, that persistence overrides consent, that suffering validates belief. These narratives do not merely misrepresent the past, they shape how present behavior is interpreted. That is why Adele Hugo's story matters so deeply now. We live in a culture saturated with storytelling. Lives are documented, shared, consumed at unprecedented speed. Mental illness is discussed openly, but often superficially. Obsession is condemned publicly, but still romanticized privately. Adele stands at the crossroads of these contradictions. She reminds us that representation is never neutral, that how we frame a life influences what we excuse, what we condemn, and what we ignore. To tell her story responsibly is not to drain it of emotion, but to refuse to aestheticize her collapse. It is to show how easily devotion can become destructive when it is the only structure left, how illness can mimic meaning, how beauty and intelligence offer no immunity. Adele Hugo does not need to be redeemed through art. She needs to be understood without distortion. Because the greatest ethical failure would not be forgetting her, but remembering her incorrectly, in ways that comfort us rather than challenge us. Once a life becomes history, it no longer belongs solely to the person who lived it. Letters are archived, journals are cataloged, memories are filtered through institutions, scholars, filmmakers, and audiences who were never there. Meaning is extracted, rearranged, and repurposed. This is the quiet afterlife of human experience. For Adèle Hugo, this afterlife has been long, active, and uneasy. She left behind thousands of pages, letters written in confidence, diaries never intended for publication, fragments of thought composed for no audience at all. These documents were not testimonies meant to instruct or persuade. They were attempts at orientation, efforts to anchor a mind struggling to maintain coherence. And yet, they have been read, quoted, interpreted, and judged. This raises a question that has no comfortable answer. Who has the right to tell a story when the subject can no longer speak back? Biographers argue that public relevance grants permission. Psychiatrists argue that analysis serves understanding. Artists argue that emotional truth transcends privacy. Each position carries merit, and each carries risk, because interpretation is never neutral. Every retelling emphasizes some elements and silences others. Every framework imposes order on chaos. And in Adele's case, order is precisely what her inner world lacked. To turn her life into narrative is, in some sense, to do violence to its unresolved nature. Yet silence is no solution either. For decades, Adèle Hugo was omitted from serious discussion, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. Her existence complicated the myth of Victor Hugo as moral giant. Her illness resisted romantic framing, her persistence embarrassed rather than inspired. Forgetting her did not protect her dignity, it erased it, the act of telling her story. Then exists tension between exposure and recognition. It risks exploitation, but it also resists disappearance. It insists that a woman who spent half her life institutionalized was still a full human being whose experiences mattered. Ownership, in this sense, is collective, but responsibility is as well. Those who tell Adele's story inherit a duty to avoid the simplifications that harmed her in life, to resist turning her into a symbol at the expense of her specificity, to allow contradiction to remain unresolved rather than smoothing it into moral clarity. She was intelligent and delusional. She was intrusive and suffering. She was privileged and profoundly vulnerable. Any version of her story that removes one of these truths is incomplete. This is where modern audiences play a role. We are no longer passive recipients of stories. We circulate them, remix them, compress them into headlines and thumbnails. In doing so, we decide, often unconsciously, what aspects of a life deserve attention. When Adèle Hugo is framed solely as a stalker, we reinforce a narrative of moral failure. When she is framed solely as a victim, we erase the harm her actions caused. When she is framed as a romantic figure, we aestheticize illness. None of these framings are neutral. They shape how similar lives are interpreted in the present, whose suffering is believed, whose behavior is condemned, whose distress is ignored. This is the ethical weight of remembering. Adèle Hugo's life does not belong to any one discipline or audience. It cannot be owned by literature, psychology, or cinema alone. It exists at their intersection, demanding a level of care that resists easy consumption. Perhaps the most respectful way to remember her is not to claim authority over her meaning, but to acknowledge uncertainty, to say, we do not fully understand what it felt like to live inside her mind. We can trace patterns, identify conditions, analyze behaviors, but we cannot reconstruct her experience without loss. This humility matters, because certainty is what destroyed her. Her illness took root in a belief that could not be questioned, a narrative that could not be disrupted, a meaning that resisted contradiction. To impose a single, definitive interpretation on her life risks repeating that violence in another form. Instead, her story asks us to hold complexity without resolution, to remember her not as an example to be solved, but as a life that continues to ask difficult questions long after its end. Who intervenes, and when? Who decides what is illness and what is choice? Who bears responsibility when suffering is visible but misread? Adèle Hugo does not offer answers, but she demands that we keep asking, and perhaps that is the only form of ownership that does not betray her. Not possession, not explanation, not judgment, but sustained attention. Obsession does not end when a person disappears. It lingers, subtly, persistently, reshaping how future stories are told, how behaviors are interpreted, how boundaries are drawn. Long after Adèle Hugo's footsteps faded from streets and ports across Europe and the Atlantic, the pattern she embodied remained. Her life casts a long shadow, not because it was extreme, but because it revealed something fundamental about the human mind when meaning collapses. Obsession rushes in to replace it. In Adele's case, obsession did not emerge as chaos. It emerged as order. Albert Pinson became the axis around which her inner world aligned. Through him, uncertainty resolved into narrative. Loneliness transformed into purpose. Motion replaced paralysis. Each decision, where to go, what to endure, what to sacrifice, felt justified because it served a single, coherent belief. This is why obsession is so dangerous, not because it feels irrational, but because it often feels clarifying. Modern psychology recognizes this mechanism clearly. Fixation can provide structure to a distressed mind, especially one shaped by loss, neglect, and emotional isolation. The object of obsession becomes less important than the role it plays, anchoring identity, organizing time, and silencing doubt. Adèle Hugo was not chasing a man. She was chasing a framework for existence. This distinction matters because it explains why logic, rejection, and evidence failed to intervene. To abandon the belief would not have meant accepting rejection. It would have meant losing the only structure holding her together. That dynamic did not vanish with the 19th century. Today, obsession wears different clothes, but it serves the same function. It appears in parasocial relationships, in fixations mediated by distance and projection, in attachments formed without reciprocity but reinforced by imagination. Technology accelerates these patterns, but it does not create them. Adele's story feels contemporary because the emotional architecture is unchanged. We still see individuals constructing meaning around unreachable figures. We still see rejection reinterpreted as hidden connection. We still struggle to intervene early when fixation presents as devotion rather than threat. What has changed is scale. In Adele's time, obsession required physical movement, ships, letters, months of travel. Today, it requires only attention. Presence can be simulated. Silence can be interpreted endlessly. Distance no longer limits fixation. It feeds it. This makes Adèle Hugo less an anomaly and more a precursor. Her life illustrates how obsession thrives in ambiguity, how it feeds on partial access, incomplete information, and imagined intimacy, how it escalates when the external world offers few competing sources of meaning. It also reveals something else that remains deeply relevant: society's reluctance to act when obsession harms primarily the person experiencing it. Adele's pursuit was tolerated for years because it did not erupt into public danger. It was inconvenient, uncomfortable, but not violent. Intervention came only after collapse, not during escalation. That pattern persists. We still respond more decisively to threat than to deterioration. We still prioritize containment over prevention. We still struggle to recognize when persistence is no longer healthy, but pathological. Adele's life invites us to reconsider this threshold. At what point does fixation stop being private suffering and become a public concern? How do we intervene without humiliation, punishment, or moral judgment? And how do we distinguish between devotion that strengthens and obsession that consumes? There are no universal answers, but there is a warning. Adèle Hugo's story shows that obsession is not always loud. It can be polite, articulate, well-funded, and culturally literate. It can quote poetry, play piano, and cross borders with dignity. It can coexist with intelligence and restraint, and because of that, it can be overlooked. The long shadow of obsession is not the spectacle of breakdown. It is the normalization of slow collapse. Adele did not frighten people until it was too late. She worried them. She confused them. She exhausted them. And then, finally, she disappeared into institutions where her story could no longer disturb public life. Her life challenges us to notice what we still struggle to notice now. The point at which meaning becomes rigid, belief becomes impermeable, and identity collapses into a single fixation. That point is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. And that is why Adèle Hugo's shadow still stretches forward into modern conversations about mental health, consent, responsibility, and care, asking whether we have truly learned to recognize obsession before it becomes the only thing left. Obsession does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped, reinforced, and sometimes rewarded by the culture that surrounds it. This is what makes Adèle Hugo's story more than an individual tragedy. It is a reflection of how societies decide which forms of fixation are acceptable, which are romanticized, and which are punished. In the 19th century, obsession hid behind the language of devotion. A woman who endured suffering for love was pitied, even admired, so long as her behavior remained discreet. Passion was framed as virtue, perseverance as loyalty, emotional intensity as depth of character. These narratives allowed Adele's deterioration to proceed largely uninterrupted, because it could still be interpreted as tragic sensitivity rather than illness. Culture gave her obsession cover. Today, the language has changed, but the mechanism remains. We live in an era that celebrates intensity. Relentless focus is praised as dedication. Emotional fixation is reframed as authenticity. The idea that meaning must be found, at all costs, permeates modern storytelling. Self-help culture and social media in this environment. Obsession often masquerades as purpose. People are encouraged to define themselves through singular passions, one person, one dream, one identity that explains everything. Ambiguity is treated as failure. Letting go is framed as weakness. Moving on is seen as betrayal of self. Adèle Hugo would have recognized this world. Her belief that meaning had to be preserved at any cost, that abandoning it would result in annihilation, is not alien to modern sensibilities. It is amplified by them. The difference is not psychological. It is technological. Where Adele crossed oceans, modern obsession crosses feeds. Where she waited months for letters, we wait minutes for notifications. Where silence once forced reflection, it now invites interpretation. Distance no longer disrupts fixation. It sustains it. This cultural shift has consequences. Obsession today can be continuous, ambient, and socially invisible. It does not require physical pursuit. It requires attention, repeated, unregulated, unchallenged attention that gradually reshapes perception. And like Adele's fixation, it often begins innocently, with admiration, with curiosity, with longing. Only later does it harden into certainty. Culture plays a crucial role in this hardening process. Narratives that equate suffering with sincerity validate persistence even when boundaries are crossed. Stories that frame rejection as a challenge encourage reinterpretation rather than acceptance. Romantic myths teach us that desire, if strong enough, must be meaningful. These ideas did not create Adele's illness, but they protected it. Her life demonstrates how cultural permission can delay recognition of harm, how obsession can be tolerated when it aligns with familiar narratives, how suffering can be aestheticized instead of addressed. This is why Adèle Hugo's story feels less like an outlier and more like a prototype. She lived before the vocabulary of modern psychology, but within a culture that already rewarded emotional endurance and self-sacrifice. Today, those values persist, translated into new forms, reinforced by constant exposure, and often stripped of the context needed to identify when devotion becomes destructive. The danger is not that obsession becomes visible. The danger is that it becomes normal, when fixation is absorbed into cultural expectation. Intervention feels intrusive. Concern feels judgmental. Boundaries feel cruel. And so, as in Adele's time, action is delayed until collapse becomes undeniable. Her story asks us to examine not only individual psychology, but collective responsibility. What kinds of longing do we encourage? Which narratives do we reward? And how often do we confuse intensity with truth? Adèle Hugo did not live in a vacuum of madness. She lived inside stories about love, endurance, and destiny that made her belief feel justified long after it should have been questioned. If obsession becomes culture, culture becomes complicit, and that may be the most unsettling legacy of her life. The realization that society does not merely respond to fixation, it often shapes the conditions under which it thrives. If Adèle Hugo's life casts a shadow, it also traces an outline. Within that outline lies a question that refuses to fade. How does a pattern like hers get broken before it hardens into inevitability? The answer is not simple, and it is not singular. Adele's collapse was not the result of one failure, but of many small absences layered over time. Breaking the pattern, therefore, does not require a dramatic intervention. It requires something quieter, earlier, and far more uncomfortable. It requires attention before crisis. Adele's distress did not begin with pursuit. It began with withdrawal, with sensitivity mistaken for fragility, with grief absorbed rather than expressed. Her environment rewarded composure and endurance, leaving little space for uncertainty or need. By the time obsession emerged, it was already filling a vacuum left by years of emotional quiet. The first opportunity for intervention was not when she crossed borders. It was when she disappeared inward. Modern mental health frameworks emphasize this distinction. Fixation does not appear fully formed. It evolves. It feeds on isolation, ambiguity, and the absence of alternative sources of meaning. Early intervention, when possible, is less about correction and more about expansion, widening a person's emotional world before it collapses around a single point. Adele lacked that expansion. Her world narrowed steadily, first by grief, then by exile, then by fixation. Each contraction made the next more likely. Once her identity fused with a single belief, dismantling it would have meant destroying the only structure she had left, breaking the pattern. Then means resisting that narrowing. It means cultivating multiple anchors, relationships, identities, meanings that can coexist without competing. It means allowing uncertainty to remain tolerable rather than rushing to resolve it at any cost. It means recognizing when persistence is no longer resilience, but rigidity. This is difficult work. It requires listening without romanticizing, intervening without humiliating, setting boundaries without abandoning. None of these responses come naturally, especially when obsession presents politely, articulate, nonviolent, inwardly focused. Adele's life shows how easily politeness delays action, because she was not disruptive, she was not urgent, because her suffering did not threaten others. It was not prioritized, because she appeared capable. She was assumed to be stable. These assumptions persist today. We still equate danger with visibility. We still respond faster to outward chaos than inward collapse. We still hesitate to intervene when someone's reality diverges quietly rather than explosively. Breaking the pattern requires a shift in what we consider alarming. Not obsession at its peak, but fixation in its early stages. Not delusion, but the inability to tolerate ambiguity. Not crisis, but constriction. It also requires cultural humility. Adele's certainty was reinforced by narratives that praised devotion and endurance. Today's culture continues to reward intensity, often at the expense of balance. Breaking the pattern means questioning stories that frame suffering as proof of authenticity and persistence as moral virtue. It means teaching that letting go is not failure. It is survival. Adèle Hugo did not fail because she loved too deeply. She failed because love became the only place where her identity could exist. The tragedy was not her attachment. It was the absence of alternatives strong enough to counterbalance it. Breaking the pattern means building those alternatives early. Community that tolerates vulnerability. Language that names distress before it escalates. Care systems that respond to quiet deterioration. Not just public danger. None of this guarantees prevention, but it shifts the trajectory. Adele's life reminds us that obsession is not an event. It is a process, and processes can be interrupted, redirected, softened, if they are recognized in time. Her story does not tell us that every fixation leads to collapse. It tells us that collapse becomes more likely when fixation is the only thing left standing. Breaking the pattern is not about erasing obsession. It is about ensuring it never becomes the sole architecture of a life. Every long descent eventually reaches a moment where nothing new can be added, only understood. For Adele Hugo, that reckoning did not arrive as confrontation or revelation. It arrived as aftermath, as the slow realization, by others, not by her, that the damage was complete, irreversible, and no longer confined to one life alone. By the time she was institutionalized, the question was no longer what is happening to Adele. It was what has already happened and what cannot be undone. The pursuit had ended. The delusion had stabilized. The movement had stopped. What remained was consequence. For Victor Hugo, the reckoning was private and brutal. Publicly, he was celebrated as the conscience of France. Privately, he faced a truth no amount of literary achievement could soften: that his daughter's life had collapsed while he was alive to witness it, and powerless to reverse it. He had fought emperors with words. He had shaped nations with ideas, but he could not reach the mind of his own child. This realization haunted his later years. He supported Adele. He visited when he could. He ensured her comfort and safety. But care is not the same as restoration. Each visit was a reminder that love had arrived too late to change the shape of her reality. The reckoning for Albert Pinson was different. He escaped Adele's orbit physically, but not historically. His name became permanently attached to a story he never consented to join. He lived the rest of his life knowing that a brief, unremarkable relationship had become the axis of another person's collapse. There was no way to correct this, no apology that would undo delusion, no explanation that would rewrite belief, no distance great enough to erase implication. Pinson carried a quieter burden, the knowledge that being chosen by someone who cannot let go is not a gift. It is a sentence without appeal. And then there was the reckoning for everyone else, for doctors who could only contain what they did not yet understand, for family members who mistook silence for stability, for a society that intervened only when collapse disrupted order. Adele's life forced each of these systems to confront their limits. Her institutionalization was not a solution. It was an acknowledgement of failure, necessary, compassionate in intent, but fundamentally reactive. It did not address what had been lost. It only prevented further harm. This is the harsh truth at the center of her story. By the time reckoning arrives, it is already too late to choose differently. The cost has been paid in advance through years of neglect, misinterpretation, and delayed response. Adele never experienced a moment of reckoning herself. There was no scene where truth broke through delusion, no awakening where belief shattered and clarity returned. Her illness did not allow for that kind of narrative satisfaction. Instead, reckoning existed around her, circling, observing, concluding, while she lived on inside a reality that no longer required resolution. This asymmetry is unsettling. We expect consequences to be felt by those who act, but in cases of severe mental illness, consequences are often borne by everyone else, by families, communities, and history itself, while the individual remains insulated within belief. Adele's story denies us moral closure. There is no point where blame can be cleanly assigned, no moment where intervention would have definitively saved her. Only a long sequence of missed thresholds, each one survivable on its own. Devastating in accumulation, the reckoning. Then, is not about judgment. It is about recognition. Recognition that suffering can progress invisibly. Recognition that love without understanding can still fail. Recognition that systems designed to respond to crisis often arrive only after identity has already collapsed. Adele Hugo's life confronts us with a difficult accounting, not of guilt, but of cost. What is the cost of silence? What is the cost of waiting? What is the cost of assuming that someone who is functioning is therefore safe? These questions do not belong to the 19th century. They belong to now. And that is why the reckoning Adele's life demands is not retrospective. It is ongoing. When a life collapses as completely as Adele Hugo's did, the most painful questions are not dramatic ones. They are conditional. If someone had noticed earlier, if someone had named what was happening, if someone had intervened when the signs were still subtle, these questions do not undo the outcome, but they force us to examine the fragile moments where a different trajectory was still possible, not guaranteed, but possible. Adele's life contained many such moments. The first came long before Albert Pinson ever entered her world, after Leopoldine's death. Grief settled into the Hugo household like a permanent resident. Victor Hugo retreated into silence and depression. The family learned to endure rather than express. For Adele, this period was formative. Her sensitivity deepened, but no language was offered to help her process loss. Sorrow became something to carry alone. This was an interruption that never happened. Grief was acknowledged, but not metabolized. Emotional needs were respected, but not actively supported. The assumption was that time would heal what words could not. Time did not. Another threshold emerged during exile. Displacement stripped Adele of familiarity, routine, and social grounding. The islands were safe, but isolating. Her world narrowed, her inward focus intensified. These were not dramatic changes, no breakdown, no rebellion, but they were signals. In modern terms, they would be called risk factors: withdrawal, rumination, a shrinking emotional environment. Still, no intervention followed. Her quietness was mistaken for adjustment, her introspection for maturity. Then came Albert Pinson. This is where hindsight most often concentrates blame, but this is also where simplification does the most harm. Pinson did not cause Adele's illness. He became the structure around which it organized itself. The crucial moment was not the proposal or the rejection. It was the shift in interpretation. When Adele began reinterpreting refusal as concealment, distance as devotion, silence as proof, the internal rules governing her reality had changed. This was not passion escalating. It was perception hardening. That was another interruption point. Someone could have named the distortion. Someone could have insisted on grounding rather than reassurance. Someone could have redirected her attachment before it became exclusive. But naming distortion is difficult when it wears the language of love. Challenging belief feels cruel when the belief sustains the believer. And in Adele's era, there was little understanding of how to intervene without shaming or confinement. So nothing happened. The pursuit escalated. Movement replaced reflection. Each journey reinforced belief. Each sacrifice deepened commitment. By the time Adele crossed the Atlantic, her identity was already fused with the delusion. At that point, interruption would have required dismantling her entire sense of meaning. This is why late intervention so often fails. Once obsession becomes the central architecture of a life, removing it feels indistinguishable from annihilation. The mind resists not because it is stubborn, but because it is surviving. Institutionalization finally stopped the motion, but not the damage. It prevented further escalation, but it could not restore what had been lost. Flexibility of thought, tolerance for ambiguity, a self not dependent on a single belief. Looking back, the tragedy is not that no one intervened. It is that intervention was only imaginable as containment, not care. This remains a challenge today. We are better at recognizing mental illness, but we still struggle to respond early when distress is quiet and coherent. We still hesitate to act when belief has not yet become dangerous. We still wait for certainty before offering support, by which time certainty has often hardened into delusion. Adèle Hugo's life teaches us that interruption does not require certainty. It requires curiosity. Curiosity about withdrawal. Curiosity about fixation. Curiosity about why meaning has narrowed rather than expanded. Interruption is not about confrontation. It is about widening the field, reintroducing alternatives before the mind decides it cannot survive without one idea, one person, one narrative. Not every life can be saved from collapse, but some trajectories can be softened, redirected, slowed. Adele's could not, because the interruptions never came early enough, and when they did, they arrived as walls rather than bridges. Her story reminds us that prevention rarely looks heroic. It looks like listening when nothing seems urgent. It looks like naming patterns before they feel extreme. It looks like taking quiet suffering seriously, even when it remains polite. The question her life leaves us with is not whether she could have been saved. It is whether we are willing to recognize the moments when saving is still possible, before reckoning replaces choice. Waiting feels harmless. It disguises itself as patience, restraint, respect for autonomy. It promises that clarity will arrive on its own, that emotions will settle, that perspective will return. That time will correct what attention might disrupt in Adèle Hugo's life. Waiting was not neutral. It was costly. Each delay carried a price that was not immediately visible, but cumulative. By the time concern crystallized into action, the cost had already been paid in narrowed perception, in rigid belief, in a self that could no longer tolerate uncertainty. The cost of waiting is rarely dramatic at first. It looks like postponement, like reassurance, like hope that things will resolve without interference. After Leopoldine's death, waiting took the form of silence. Grief was honored, but not spoken through. Time was expected to heal what expression might reopen. Adele learned that sorrow was something to endure quietly, not something to bring forward for examination. That lesson stayed with her during exile. Waiting took the form of distance. Adele's withdrawal was noticed, but interpreted as adaptation. She was given space rather than structure, solitude rather than support. Her inner world grew denser, less permeable to correction, by the time Albert Pinson appeared. Waiting had become reflex. When Adele's interpretations began to diverge from reality, those around her hesitated. They softened their responses. They avoided direct contradiction. They hoped affection, time, or simple fatigue would bring the fixation to an end. Waiting felt kinder than confrontation, but kindness without clarity can enable distortion. Each moment of inaction allowed belief to stabilize further. Each unchallenged reinterpretation strengthened the internal logic she relied on. By the time her pursuit crossed borders, waiting was no longer passive, it had become complicity. This is not a moral accusation. It is a structural reality. Waiting transfers responsibility from the present to the future. It assumes that deterioration will either self-correct or declare itself loudly enough to demand action, in cases like Adele's. Neither happened. Her illness was coherent. Her behavior was purposeful. Her suffering was articulate. Nothing about her demanded emergency. And so, emergency never came. Only containment. Much later, when collapse could no longer be ignored, the cost of waiting was not borne by one person. Victor Hugo paid it in regret. Albert Pinson paid it in lifelong association with a tragedy he could not prevent. Adele paid it in decades of institutional life. Society paid it in misunderstanding, by absorbing her story only after it was safe, only after it could be interpreted without obligation. Waiting always feels safer than acting too soon. But Adele Hugo's life shows us what waiting protects. Not the person in distress, but the comfort of those observing. It protects social harmony. It protects reputations. It protects uncertainty from being named. And in doing so, it allows patterns to harden beyond reach. This lesson is difficult because it offers no clean instruction. Acting too early can feel intrusive. Acting too late can feel inevitable. The line between respect and neglect is not always clear, but Adele's story suggests a guiding principle. Waiting should never be the default response to narrowing lives. When someone's world contracts around a single belief, a single relationship, a single explanation, waiting is not neutral. It is a choice that favors stasis over possibility. Intervention does not require accusation. It requires engagement, naming patterns, expanding context, offering alternative anchors before one belief becomes the only thing holding a life together. The cost of waiting is not always visible in the moment. It appears later, in asylums, in regrets, in stories told after the fact, when action is no longer possible. Adele Hugo's life reminds us that by the time collapse is undeniable, waiting has already done its work, and that may be the most uncomfortable truth of all. Every story that lasts this long eventually confronts the same question. What did it all mean? Not meaning as moral lesson or cautionary slogan, but meaning as it existed for the person who lived it, moment by moment, belief by belief, long before historians, doctors, or audiences tried to make sense of it. For Adele Hugo, meaning was never abstract. It was survival, from the outside. Her life appears to fracture at obvious points: grief, exile, rejection, illness. From the inside, those fractures were less important than the continuity she fought to preserve. The pursuit of Albert Pinson was not a rupture in her identity. It was the mechanism by which she tried to keep one. This is the hardest truth to accept. Adele's obsession did not destroy meaning. It created it. Before Pinson, her world was diffuse and unstable, filled with loss, overshadowed by greatness, deprived of emotional certainty. After Pinson, everything aligned. Pain became purposeful. Movement replaced paralysis. Suffering gained explanation. She did not ask whether her belief was true. She asked whether it was livable, and for a time, it was. This reframes the tragedy entirely. Adele Hugo was not chasing illusion for its own sake. She was protecting herself from a void that felt more dangerous than delusion. The mind, when faced with annihilating ambiguity, will often choose a false certainty over no certainty at all. That choice is not weakness. It is adaptation. This is where the reckoning of meaning becomes uncomfortable for us as observers, because it forces us to acknowledge that what saved Adele in the short term destroyed her in the long term, and that no clean alternative was ever offered. Her world never expanded again after it narrowed. Institutionalization removed danger, but it did not restore meaning. It replaced obsession with routine, delusion with management, motion with stillness, for the rest of her life. Adele existed in a state that was safe, but stripped of future, from the perspective of care systems. This was success. From the perspective of a human life, it was containment. Adele lived for more than 40 years after her pursuit ended. Those decades are often treated as epilogue, empty time, irrelevant time. But for Adele, they were life itself, a quieter, diminished life, but not a non-existent one. She read, she listened to music, she remembered fragments of beauty. Meaning did not vanish, it shrank. This forces us to confront a question we rarely ask honestly. Is survival without meaning a victory? For medicine, perhaps. For institutions, perhaps. For history, perhaps. But for the person living it, the answer is less clear. Adele Hugo did not regain agency, but she retained humanity. She was not cured, but she was not erased. Her later years were not dramatic, but they were not empty either. They existed in a narrow corridor between coherence and collapse, a place many people with severe mental illness still inhabit today. This is the final reckoning her life demands, not a verdict on her actions, not a ranking of failures, but an examination of what we prioritize when meaning collapses. Do we preserve life at all costs, even if that life becomes static? Do we intervene only to stop harm, or also to restore possibility? Do we accept containment as enough when imagination, identity, and future have been lost? Adele's story offers no answers, only tension. Her life ended without reconciliation, without clarity, without the restoration of the self she once was. But it did not end without dignity. That dignity came not from triumph, but from endurance, from continuing to exist when existence itself had been radically reduced. The reckoning of meaning, then, is not about what Adele Hugo achieved or failed to achieve. It is about what we consider meaningful enough to protect. Her life suggests that meaning is not a luxury added after survival. It is the structure that makes survival bearable. And when that structure collapses, the human mind will build another, no matter how fragile, no matter how costly, unless something stronger is offered in its place. Adele Hugo was never offered that alternative, and that may be the most important truth of all. When meaning collapses, something always remains. It is rarely grand, it is rarely visible from the outside, but it is there, quiet, persistent, resisting disappearance. For Adele Hugo, what remained after obsession no longer sustained her was not clarity, not recovery, and not redemption. It was routine, in the asylum. Days were structured to minimize harm rather than cultivate purpose. Time was divided into manageable segments, Meals, walks, reading hours, sleep. This structure did not ask Adele who she was or who she wanted to become. It asked only that she exist safely within its boundaries, and so she did. This is the uncomfortable reality of life after meaning breaks. Existence continues. Even when identity no longer has space to evolve, the future narrows into repetition. The past becomes unreliable. What remains is the present, thin, manageable, contained, for Adele. That present included books. She read obsessively, but not desperately. Reading offered stability without demand, unlike people. Texts did not expect her to change, to respond appropriately, or to relinquish belief. They offered coherence without confrontation. Music, too, survived. When she played the piano, witnesses noted a concentration that felt almost sacred. Her fingers remembered what her mind struggled to integrate. Sound did not require narrative. It existed entirely in the moment, an experience that did not need to be explained or defended. These were not signs of recovery. They were signs of residue, the parts of a person that remain functional even after the larger architecture of meaning has collapsed. Modern psychiatry recognizes this phenomenon. Severe mental illness rarely erases a person entirely. It fractures identity, but fragments persist. Interests endure, capacities survive. A life reduced is still a life. This complicates how we think about outcomes. Adèle Hugo did not return to society, but she was not empty. She did not regain autonomy, but she retained sensitivity. Her later years were not productive by conventional standards, but they were not devoid of experience. This challenges the binary we often apply to illness, cured or lost. Adele existed in between. That in-between space is rarely acknowledged in stories because it resists resolution. It does not offer triumph or tragedy in the traditional sense. It offers continuation, quiet, limited, persistent. And that may be the most difficult aspect of her life to accept, because it suggests that even when meaning breaks, life does not end, it adapts. This adaptation is not inherently hopeful. It can be deeply unsettling. It raises ethical questions we still struggle with. What kind of life is worth preserving? What do we owe to those whose futures have narrowed beyond recognition? Is safety enough when possibility has vanished? Adele's later life does not answer these questions. It embodies them. She lived for decades in a state that was neither crisis nor fulfillment. She was protected, fed, and housed. She was also confined, limited, and removed from the world that had once shaped her, from the outside. This looks like survival at minimal cost. From the inside, it is impossible to know. This uncertainty is important. It prevents us from retroactively imposing meaning where none may have existed. It resists the temptation to frame her endurance as redemption. It honors the reality that some lives continue without narrative satisfaction. What remains after meaning breaks is not lesson or closure. It is presence. Adèle Hugo remained present to music, to language, to moments of calm. She remained present to her own inner world. Even as that world became smaller and more self-contained, she was not restored, but she was not erased. And in that persistence, her life forces us to reconsider how we measure value, not by productivity, not by recovery, not by coherence, but by the simple fact of continued experience. The question her life leaves us with is not whether her later years were worth living. It is whether we are willing to acknowledge lives that continue outside our preferred narratives of success. Healing, and meaning. Adele Hugo lived such a life, and in doing so, she asks us to expand our understanding of what it means to remain human when meaning itself has fractured beyond repair. There was no final revelation, no moment where truth arrived fully formed and settled everything that had been broken. No late clarity that redeemed suffering or transformed endurance into wisdom. Adele Hugo's life did not conclude with understanding. It concluded with quiet. By the end, she no longer needed the certainty that had once driven her across oceans. The obsession that had consumed her youth had dissolved. Not because it was disproven, but because it had exhausted its purpose. It could no longer organize her world. It could no longer protect her from ambiguity. What remained was not acceptance. It was stillness. Inside the asylum, days unfolded without urgency. There was no future to anticipate, no past to resolve. Memory drifted in fragments, untethered from consequence. The world outside continued to accelerate. New wars, new technologies, new ideas. But Adele lived in a time that no longer moved forward. This is the ending we resist most. Not collapse, not tragedy, but continuation without resolution. Because it offers no moral victory. Adele Hugo did not learn from her suffering. She did not emerge wiser or stronger. She did not transform pain into insight that could be passed on. Her endurance was not meaningful in the way stories prefer endurance to be. It was simply survival, and that, perhaps, is the most honest ending her life could have. She survived not because her life made sense, but because life persisted anyway. Because even when meaning fractures beyond repair, the human organism continues, adapting to smaller worlds, narrower identities, quieter forms of presence. Adele's later years did not restore what had been lost. They preserved what could not be taken, her capacity to experience sound, language, and moments of calm. These were not triumphs. They were remnants. But remnants matter. They remind us that human worth does not vanish when coherence does, that a life does not cease to be a life when it stops fitting the shapes we expect. When Adele died in 1915, there was no reckoning that gathered everything into a final truth. History absorbed her quietly. The world moved on. Her death passed unnoticed amid a war that consumed millions. And yet, her story did not disappear. It lingered because it resisted simplification, because it refused to deliver the satisfaction of clear blame or clear redemption, because it exposed how easily suffering can go unnoticed when it does not disrupt order. Adele Hugo's life does not demand that we admire her. It asks that we see her, not as a symbol, not as a diagnosis, not as a warning reduced to spectacle, but as a human being whose need for meaning was never adequately met, and who built one anyway, at unbearable cost. The quiet ending of her life mirrors the quiet beginning of her collapse. Both unfolded without alarms. Both were shaped by what was absent rather than what was present. Attention came too late. Care came only as containment. Understanding arrived only after everything that could be understood had already hardened into permanence. This is not a story about madness conquering reason. It is a story about silence outlasting urgency. And that may be why Adele Hugo still matters. Because her life reminds us that the most devastating endings are not always loud. They do not announce themselves with catastrophe. They arrive slowly, politely, and without resolution, leaving behind a question that cannot be answered after the fact. Who might she have been? If someone had intervened while her world was still wide enough to change, there is no answer. Only the responsibility of remembering that such moments exist now, as they did then, and that waiting for clarity often means waiting until it is no longer possible. Adèle Hugo's story ends quietly, but the challenge it leaves us does not.